Terminal Care. Chapter 1. The Soft Target. Vaxen Kal had killed in 43 star systems, and not once had a target required a walker to reach the bathroom. The thought crossed his mind at 12,000 meters, plummeting through Terran airspace in a dive that would liquefy an unshielded organism. His Spectre 7 infiltration suit compensated automatically, adjusting internal pressure and routing coolant through the dermal layer as atmospheric friction built to a scream outside his helmet. The heads-up display painted his retinas with cascading data: velocity, altitude, thermal signature, electromagnetic output. Every number was green, every system was optimal. He was a 90-kilogram projectile of lethality wrapped in 40 million credits of bleeding-edge military technology, and his targets were geriatrics who probably needed help opening pickle jars. The contract brief had been insulting in its simplicity. 6 names, 1 location, no security detail listed, no defensive installations, no automated countermeasures. Just a retirement facility called Serene Vistas, nestled in the hills outside New Montreal like a tumor made of architectural banality and beige paint. The client, a Xylosian trade consortium with more money than tactical sense, had specified minimal collateral damage and discreet elimination. Kahl had almost doubled his fee just for the disrespect of being sent after targets, who probably had afternoon naps scheduled between doses of blood thinners. At 3,000 meters, he deployed the glide foils. The suit's shoulder plates snapped outward with pneumatic precision, catching the air and converting his suicidal descent into a controlled spiral. Below, serene vistas resolved from a blocky smudge into architectural detail. The main building was 3 stories of that uniquely Terran aesthetic that screamed, "We have given up on beauty in favor of function, and we're not even good at that." Cream-colored walls, red tile roof, a central courtyard with what looked like a koi pond that probably violated 17 health codes. Surrounding gardens arranged in geometric precision that suggested either a landscaping service or obsessive-compulsive disorder. The perimeter fence was the first thing that bothered him. It was rusty, not artfully weathered, not charmingly vintage, but genuinely corroded, with oxidation blooms spreading across the chain link like melanoma. Posts tilted at angles that would make a structural engineer weep. In an era where holographic barriers could be programmed to electrocute intruders based on genetic markers, someone had protected a facility housing former fleet admirals with hardware that looked salvaged from a 20th century prison yard. Kahl logged it as negligence, critical, and added another 0 to his mental invoice. If they couldn't even maintain basic physical security, he'd be done before the dinner shift started. He landed on the north roof with barely a whisper, the suit's impact dampeners absorbing kinetic energy and bleeding it out as waste heat. The roofing tiles were clay, old enough to have moss growing in the grooves. He ran a structural analysis, load-bearing capacity within acceptable parameters, though the tiles themselves would crack under sustained pressure. Not that it mattered. He'd be through the ventilation access in under 2 minutes. The fence nagged at him, though. Something about it felt wrong in a way his tactical training couldn't quantify. He pushed the thought aside and focused on the mission clock. 11 minutes since insertion, right on schedule. He deployed a surveillance microdrone, a thing the size of a horsefly with sensor packages worth more than some planetary GDP figures. It zipped down through a roof vent, navigating the ductwork with autonomous precision, while feeding video directly to his optical nerve. The common room materialized in his vision. Hardwood floors worn to a shine by decades of shuffling feet. Furniture upholstered in patterns that had been unfashionable when Kahl's grandparents were young. And a massive picture window looking out over gardens that probably required a full-time staff to maintain. 6 humans occupied the space, and Kahl's threat assessment software struggled to find anything worth flagging. The first one sat in a recliner that had molded itself to his body over what must have been years of use. Admiral Chen, according to the dossier. Former drone fleet commander, 87 years old, recipient of the Solar Cross for actions at the Battle of Titan's Shadow. In person, he looked like someone's grandfather who'd been left in the sun too long, all weathered skin and liver spots, squinting at a physical newspaper through reading glasses thick enough to start fires. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. Not Parkinson's, the medical overlay suggested. Just age. The second target, Admiral Holloway, was mid-argument with a third figure Kahl identified as Admiral Switchboard, Sally Morrison. The topic appeared to be oatmeal. Specifically, whether instant oatmeal constituted a war crime under the revised Geneva Conventions. Holloway, 82, former Chief of Engineering for the Fifth Fleet, gestured emphatically with a spoon that she wielded like a conductor's baton. She wore a cardigan that might have been stylish in 2145 and slippers that had cartoon cats on them. The medical readout flagged her as post-hip replacement, mild osteoarthritis, elevated cholesterol. Kahl felt something that wasn't quite disappointment, but wasn't quite relief either. These weren't warriors. They were historical footnotes in cardigans, killing time until time killed them back. Admiral Vance drew his attention next, mostly because the man moved like he was negotiating with gravity on every step. 91 years old, former Grand Admiral of the 3rd Expansion Fleet, the man who'd held the line at Proxima while the civilian evacuation completed, buying 40,000 lives with a undermanned battle group that shouldn't have lasted 40 minutes. Kahl had studied that engagement at the Academy, back when he'd still believed in things like honor and sacrifice. Vance had been a titan then, a tactical genius who could read fleet movements like poetry. Now he was a stooped figure in a bathrobe, shuffling toward the coffee station with a cane that looked like it had been carved from actual wood instead of sensible polymer composite. He moved with the kind of careful deliberation that suggested every step was a calculated risk, and dropping the cane meant 10 seconds of struggle to retrieve it. Kahl watched him fumble with a coffee mug, nearly dropping it twice before successfully pouring from the carafe. "They call these Grand Admirals?" Kahl muttered into his helmet's voice recorder, establishing mission log timestamp 0.1322. "I've seen Moss with faster reaction times. This isn't a hit. This is euthanasia with extra steps." The remaining 3 targets were scattered around the room in various states of elderly repose. Admiral O'Malley was doing something with purple yarn that might have been knitting. Former Naval Logistics, 85, the man who'd kept supply lines open during the Sagittarius campaign when half the fleet was running on fumes and spite. Now he was making what appeared to be a deeply ugly scarf. Kahl's HUD compiled the data into a final tactical assessment, overlaying threat indicators across his field of vision. 6 targets, 0 viable combat capability, no weapons detected, no tactical coordination evident. The threat matrix painted them in cool blues and greens, colors reserved for environmental hazards and non-combatants. His targeting software didn't even bother calculating kill order priority because the sequence didn't matter. They were civilians in all but historical footnote. He watched Admiral Vance shuffle to the kitchenette counter, moving with that painful deliberation that characterized every action. The old man reached for a jar on the shelf, something in clear glass that might have been pickles or preserves. His hands, marked with age spots and trembling with what the medical overlay flagged as essential tremor, closed around the jar. He tried to twist the lid, failed, adjusted his grip, tried again. The lid refused to budge. Kahl's HUD, still running its threat analysis, continued to scroll data in his peripheral vision. Cardiovascular capacity diminished, reaction time degraded, fine motor control impaired. Recommended engagement protocol, close quarters, minimal force required. Estimated time to neutralize, 4.2 seconds per target. Predicted resistance, negligible. Vance gave up on the jar, set it back on the counter with a soft clink, and shuffled back to his chair empty-handed. The defeat of a man who'd once commanded battle groups across 3 sectors, now conquered by a pickle jar and arthritis. Kahl recalled the drone and began mapping his entry route. The ventilation system was oversized, a relic of construction standards from an era when buildings were designed by engineers instead of cost optimization algorithms. He could infiltrate through the main return duct, bypass the common areas entirely, and begin eliminations starting with the north wing bedrooms. Clean, simple, professional. He was halfway into the vent access when his suit's electromagnetic sensor threw up a warning flag. Proximity alert. High voltage charge detected. He froze, running a diagnostic. The readout painted a picture that didn't make sense. The perimeter fence, The rusty, corroded chain link that looked like it couldn't stop a determined squirrel was outputting 47,000 volts of unfiltered current. Not the clean, frequency-modulated power of modern security systems. Raw electricity, the kind that didn't care about shield harmonics or frequency hopping because it didn't operate on any frequency. It was just brute force amperage looking for something to complete a circuit. His suit would have protected him from any standard security field. The energy dissipation matrix could handle directed energy weapons, electromagnetic pulses, even tactical plasma discharge. But this was the electrical equivalent of a brick to the face. No sophistication, no elegance, just enough voltage to bypass his shields entirely and cook him inside his own suit like a potato in an expensive microwave. He'd walked right past it. If he'd touched it during his approach, the mission would have ended with him seizing on the ground while his synapses fired at random and his bowels evacuated into a 40 million credit combat suit. Kahl felt the first cold finger of doubt trace down his spine. He pushed it away with professional discipline and continued into the vent. But the math had changed. The fence wasn't negligence. It was camouflage. Someone had deliberately made it look like derelict trash to hide the fact that it was a lethal barrier rendered in corroded chain link. Below him, transmitted through the building's structure, he heard the faint clink of a spoon tapping against glass. Rhythmic, deliberate. 3 short taps, 3 long, 3 short again. If he'd had any training in pre-digital communication protocols, he might have recognized it as Morse code. He might have translated the simple pattern that predated wireless transmission by centuries. But Vaxen Kal was a modern professional, educated in electronic warfare and digital infiltration, and Morse code was as relevant to him as cuneiform tablets. He heard the tapping, logged it as ambient noise, negligible, and continued his careful progress through the ductwork toward the north hallway access point. The hallway floor beneath the vent was hardwood, polished to a mirror shine by decades of foot traffic. Beautiful work, really. Maple, if Kahl's material database was accurate. Probably original to the building's construction, maintained out of either pride or inability to afford modern composite flooring. He dropped from the vent access with practiced silence, his boots making contact with the wood in a controlled descent that distributed his weight across maximum surface area. The impact made no sound at all, which was exactly as it should have been. He was a professional. He was invisible. The floorboard clicked, not creaked, clicked. The distinct sound of a mechanical trigger engaging, metal on metal. A sound that didn't belong in a simple hallway floor. Kahl froze, every combat instinct screaming. His helmet display erupted with warnings as pressure sensors detected the activation of something beneath the floorboards. Something old, something mechanical, something that operated on principles that predated his expensive electronic countermeasures. He ran a diagnostic, cycling through sensor arrays and scanning protocols. Nothing. No explosive signature, no power surge, no chemical compound indicators. The pressure plate he'd triggered wasn't connected to anything his suit could detect because it wasn't connected to anything wireless. Just old copper wiring running through the walls to some endpoint his sensors couldn't map because they were designed to intercept electromagnetic signals, not trace physical circuits. The hallway remained silent. No alarms, no defensive systems activating, no response at all. Kahl's tactical training reasserted itself over his momentary panic. He analyzed the situation logically. This was a retirement facility, not a military installation. The pressure plate was probably a relic from some ancient security system, installed decades ago when the building was first constructed and long since disconnected or degraded into non-functionality. The kind of legacy infrastructure that riddled old buildings because removing it cost more than leaving it in place to click harmlessly under the feet of residents who'd probably stopped noticing it years ago. He took another careful step forward, deliberately avoiding the board he'd triggered. The hallway remained silent. The walls didn't explode. The ceiling didn't open up to release defensive drones. Nothing happened because nothing was going to happen. Just an old building settling into its bones, full of antiquated systems that no longer served any purpose beyond making paranoid assassins waste time on threat assessments. See? Nothing. Paranoia was the enemy of efficiency, and Kahl was nothing if not efficient. The bedroom doors stretched ahead of him, each one a simple barrier between him and mission completion. 6 targets, 20 minutes. Then extraction and payment and the satisfaction of a contract fulfilled. He'd tell the story later, maybe over drinks at the Void's Edge Cantina. The time he'd gotten spooked by a creaky floorboard while eliminating targets so frail they couldn't open their own pickle jars. His hand moved toward the first bedroom door. 2 floors below in the common room, Admiral Vance shifted slightly in his chair. His cane, the one that looked like it had been carved from actual wood, slipped from where it rested against the armrest. He caught it without looking, adjusted his grip on the polished walnut shaft, and tapped it once against the floor. A single deliberate knock that resonated through the hardwood with a hollow thunk. Admiral Holloway reached for her tablet, the one with bird-watching journal written across the cover in cheerful handwriting. She made a single notation in neat, precise handwriting. North Hallway, 1422. Then she set it down and returned to her oatmeal as if nothing had happened at all. Chapter 2. The Early Bird Special. The argument about oatmeal had been going on for 6 minutes, and Admiral Holloway was prepared to die on this particular hill. "Instant oatmeal," she declared, jabbing her spoon toward Admiral Morrison with the precision of an artillery spotter calling coordinates, "is a crime against humanity. The texture is wrong. The consistency is wrong. It tastes like someone described oatmeal to an algorithm and the algorithm had a stroke." Admiral Switchboard Sally Morrison set down her coffee cup with the kind of deliberate care that suggested she was exercising immense restraint. "It saves time. Time that could be spent on more productive activities than standing over a pot watching grain absorb water. That's called cooking, Sally. It's what separates us from the animals. The animals don't eat oatmeal at all, which frankly makes them smarter than both of us." Admiral Chen turned a page of his newspaper without looking up. His coffee spoon rested against his saucer, and as he read an article about tariff disputes in the outer colonies, he tapped the spoon against the porcelain. 3 short taps. 3 long. 3 short. A pattern that had survived centuries because sometimes the old ways were simply better than anything digital encryption could offer. Admiral Vance, seated at the head of the table with his back to the window, adjusted his reading glasses and studied the morning's crossword puzzle. His pen hovered over 37 down. Pest control method, 6 letters. He wrote carefully, poison. Then he tapped his own spoon against his coffee mug. 2 taps, a pause, 2 more taps. Holloway picked up the beat without missing a beat in her oatmeal tirade. "And don't get me started on the so-called flavor packets. Artificial maple, artificial brown sugar. If you're going to commit culinary fraud, at least have the decency to..." She tapped her knife against the edge of her plate. Once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. To anyone listening casually, it was 3 elderly people arguing about breakfast food with the kind of intensity that suggested they had nothing better to do. To anyone who'd spent 40 years coordinating fleet movements across hostile space using nothing but signal lamps and radio clicks, it was a tactical briefing. Hostile. Roof. North vent. Target acquired. Tracking active. Admiral O'Malley shuffled into the dining room, purple yarn trailing from the ugly scarf he'd been knitting since Tuesday. He poured himself a cup of coffee that was roughly 40% cream and 60% sugar, a mixture that could probably be classified as a war crime in 16 systems. He settled into his chair with a grunt that suggested his hip replacement was acting up again. "What's the argument this morning?" he asked, though his eyes were already tracking to the tablet Holloway had set face down beside her plate. "The philosophical implications of instant oatmeal," Sally replied. "Ah, the usual then." Vance set down his crossword and pulled a cloth napkin from the holder. The napkins at Serene Vistas were the old-fashioned kind, white linen that had to be washed and pressed, because the facility's founder had believed that paper napkins were a symptom of societal decay. Vance smoothed it out on the table and produced a pen from his bathrobe pocket. "I believe," he said conversationally, "that this calls for a wager." Holloway's eyes lit up with the kind of enthusiasm that most people reserve for winning the lottery. "I'm listening." "The weeds," Vance continued, sketching a rough floor plan of Serene Vistas on the napkin. are coming in through the roof. North side. They'll spread through the ventilation unless we take preventative measures. Preventative measures, Chen repeated, still not looking up from his newspaper. That's the second time this month. The landscaping service is clearly not up to standard. Should we call an exterminator? Sally asked. Where's the fun in that? Holloway replied. I say we let nature take its course. See how far the infestation spreads before intervention becomes necessary. Vance nodded sagely and drew an X on the napkin, marking the north hallway. I propose a friendly wager. Standard pension credit stakes. I estimate the weeds will reach the rose garden before noon. Possibly the shuffleboard court if they're particularly aggressive. O'Malley leaned forward to study the napkin map. That's optimistic. My money says they don't make it past the library. The air circulation in that wing is terrible. Anything trying to spread through those vents will suffocate before it gets far. 500 credits on the library, Holloway said immediately. But I think you're underestimating the persistence of weeds. They're remarkably resilient, especially the invasive species. Chen finally looked up from his newspaper, squinting at the napkin through his reading glasses. What kind of weeds are we discussing? The fast-moving kind or the slow, methodical kind? Professional grade, Holloway said. Expensive equipment. Probably thinks it's clever. Ah, the overconfident kind. Chen tapped his spoon again. 3 shorts, 3 longs, 3 shorts. Those are always the most entertaining. They never expect the sprinklers. Vance made a notation on the napkin in his careful, precise handwriting. The kind of script that belonged on historical documents and letters to heads of state. Current pool, library at 500 credits from Holloway and O'Malley. Rose garden at 500 from myself. Sally. East wing common area, Sally said. That's where the old HVC controls are. If the weeds reach that far, they could cause some real damage. I give it 400 credits, and I want hazard pay if I have to rewire anything. Noted. Vance drew another X. Chen? I'm not participating in the betting pool, Chen said primly. I'm simply here to observe and ensure fairness. You said that about the bingo game last month, and then you won 700 credits. That was different. That was skill-based. This is skill-based, Holloway protested. It takes tremendous skill to properly predict the movement patterns of invasive vegetation. Above them, transmitted through the building's infrastructure in ways that modern wireless sensors could never detect, came the faint sound of something moving through the ventilation system. A scraping noise, barely audible, of advanced tactical armor negotiating ductwork that had been designed in an era when people built things to last instead of to quarterly profit margins. Vance's pen paused over the napkin. Did anyone hear that? Hear what? O'Malley asked, though his eyes were sharp. Nothing. My hearing aid must be picking up interference again. You should get that looked at. I should. But the warranty expired in 2165 and replacement parts are hard to find. The pen resumed its movement, adding small notations to the floor plan. Arrows indicating probable movement vectors. Circles marking choke points. Little stars where interesting things might happen. It looked like nothing so much as a grandfather planning his garden beds, except the arrows were tactical approach lanes and the stars were trap activation points. In the north hallway, 2 floors above the dining room, Vaxen Kal moved through the darkness of the ventilation system with the confidence of a predator who had never encountered a threat he couldn't neutralize or avoid. His suit's internal mapping system had built a complete 3-dimensional model of Serene Vista's layout, color-coded by threat level and tactical value. The bedrooms were marked in soft blue, civilian spaces, minimal defensive value, optimal strike zones. The common areas glowed yellow, higher foot traffic, increased exposure risk, low priority. The maintenance corridors and service ducts like the one he currently occupied were gray, neutral territory, neither dangerous nor valuable. His HUD painted threat assessments across his field of vision in crisp, professional detail. Structural integrity, confirmed. Air quality, optimal. Hostile presence, 0. Every sensor, every analysis protocol, every piece of expensive military hardware worth more than a small nation's GDP told him the same thing. He was alone, undetected, and in complete control. 2 floors below, Admiral Vance finished drawing on a coffee-stained breakfast napkin with a ballpoint pen that probably cost less than the ink cartridge in Kahl's helmet recorder. His tactical map was crude: hand-drawn boxes for rooms, wavy lines for corridors, little X marks for bedding positions. The whole thing looked like something a child might doodle during a boring family dinner, except the child was a former Grand Admiral, and the doodle was tracking a 40 million credit assassination asset with the same casual precision he'd once used to coordinate fleet movements across 3 sectors. His HUD painted threat assessments across his field of vision in crisp, professional detail. Structural integrity, confirmed. Air quality, optimal. Hostile presence, 0. Every sensor, every analysis protocol, every piece of expensive military hardware told him the same thing. He was alone, undetected, and in complete control. He'd been inside the facility for 19 minutes and had achieved exactly 0 progress toward mission completion. This annoyed him on a professional level. He was being too cautious, too methodical. These were targets who couldn't open pickle jars, not hardened military installations. Time to accelerate the timeline. In the dining room, Holloway picked up her tablet and tapped the screen once. The display showed a grainy black and white image from a camera that looked like it had been manufactured during the first moon landing. The video quality was terrible, full of scan lines and analog artifacts that would have been unacceptable in any modern security system. But the image was clear enough: a humanoid figure in dark armor, crawling through a ventilation duct, heading east toward the residential wing. She stuck a small adhesive note to the tablet's edge. Someone had written on it in cheerful marker, "Pest Control TV." "He's taking the scenic route," she observed, setting the tablet on the table where the others could see it. Vance glanced at the screen and made a mark on his napkin scoreboard. The floor plan he'd sketched was crude but accurate, showing the major corridors and access points with the kind of institutional knowledge that came from living somewhere for 2 decades. "East Wing." That gives O'Malley an early lead. "Don't celebrate yet," O'Malley replied, studying the grainy image. "The night is young. It's 7:30 in the morning. Metaphorically young." On the tablet screen, Kahl paused at a junction point, his helmet tilting left and right as he scanned for threats. His suit's sensor suite was working overtime, painting the ductwork ahead with electromagnetic sweeps and thermal imaging, looking for traps that didn't exist, worried about defenses that would never trigger. Because the admirals weren't interested in stopping him. Not yet. Where was the entertainment in that? Chen folded his newspaper with crisp, precise movements and set it aside. For the first time since the conversation began, he looked directly at the tablet screen. His eyes, roomy and watery behind thick glasses, tracked the figure in the ductwork with the focus of a man who'd spent decades coordinating drone swarms across hostile territory. "He's favoring his left side," Chen observed, "probably compensating for equipment weight distribution. That suit is carrying a lot of hardware. Good for offensive capability, bad for sustained maneuverability in confined spaces." "Professional assessment?" Sally asked. "Professional interest." Holloway made a notation on the tablet with a stylus, marking Kahl's current position with a small digital pin. Current vector puts him at the East Wing residential corridor in approximately 4 minutes. After that, he'll have to choose between north access or the central stairwell. He'll go north, Vance predicted. Shorter route to the target bedrooms. More direct. That's what his tactical software will recommend. "I disagree," O'Malley said. "He's been cautious so far. One trigger in the north hallway has made him paranoid. He'll take the longer route through the center just to avoid potential choke points." "Care to make that official?" Vance asked, pen hovering over the napkin. "Add 50 credits to my library stake. North access, 8 minutes. Vance wrote it down with the careful penmanship of someone who'd signed fleet deployment orders and peace treaties with equal precision. The napkin was starting to look less like breakfast doodles and more like a tactical operations ledger. Bets and counter-bets, probability calculations disguised as lunch money. On screen, Kahl made his choice and turned north, exactly as Vance had predicted. O'Malley sighed and pushed another stack of pension credit chits toward the center of the table. "You're reading him too well." "I'm reading his software too well," Vance corrected. "He's letting his suit make the decisions. That's the problem with modern tradecraft. Too much faith in the electronics, not enough faith in instinct. Instinct would tell him to leave, Sally pointed out. Exactly. The morning sun climbed higher outside the windows, painting the dining room in warm golden light. Somewhere in the building, a clock chimed the quarter hour. 7:45 a.m. The breakfast dishes were cooling. The coffee was getting low. And somewhere above them, a very expensive assassin was crawling through very old ductwork, completely unaware that his every move was being watched on equipment that belonged in a museum. Chen tapped his spoon against his saucer one final time. 3 shorts, 3 longs, 3 shorts. Not because anyone needed the signal anymore, but because some habits were too old to break. Admiral Vance set down his pen and reached for his coffee cup. He took a slow sip, savoring the blend, and set it down with a satisfied sigh. His eyes remained on the tablet screen, watching Kahl's thermal signature move through the ductwork like a bright spot of heat against the building's cool infrastructure. "Well then," Vance said conversationally, as if commenting on the weather or the quality of the morning toast, "I suppose we should give our guest something to keep him occupied." Holloway's fingers were already on the tablet, navigating through menus that looked like they'd been designed by someone who'd learned user interface design from a 1980s mainframe manual. She found what she was looking for and paused, finger hovering over a toggle labeled simply Automated Systems. She looked at Vance, waiting. Admiral Vance picked up his napkin and dabbed at a coffee stain on his bathrobe. The motion was casual, unhurried. The action of a man with all the time in the world and no particular place to be. He set the napkin down. "Release the Roomba," he said. Holloway tapped the screen. And somewhere in the East Wing, something that had been dormant for a very long time began to wake up. Chapter 3. Frequency Jam. The East Wing corridor was empty when Kahl dropped from the vent access point. His boots made contact with hardwood floor in a controlled descent, weight distributed across maximum surface area. No creaks, no clicks. Just the whisper of advanced materials meeting old wood, a sound so quiet it barely qualified as sound at all. His suit's threat assessment swept the corridor and found nothing. No motion, no heat signatures, no electromagnetic activity beyond the background hum of old building wiring that probably hadn't been updated since the facility's construction. The residential wing access was 15 meters ahead, behind a door that his sensors identified as unlocked and unmonitored. Time to stop being cautious. Time to be what he was paid to be. Efficient, lethal, and gone before anyone knew he'd been there. His hand moved to his suit's control interface, fingers dancing across the haptic panel with muscle memory precision. Active camouflage engaged with a soft electronic hum that only he could hear, a frequency below human auditory range. The suit's outer layer shifted and adapted, matching the ambient light conditions and background textures with enough fidelity to fool both organic eyes and most electronic sensors. He watched his own hand disappear, watched the hallway become visible through where his arm should be, watched reality bend around him like water around a stone. 40 million credits of optical engineering, reducing him to nothing more than a shimmer in the air, a heat distortion that could be mistaken for warm air rising from a heating vent. Invisible, undetectable, perfect. The residential wing door was 10 meters ahead. He moved toward it with the confidence of a predator who'd activated this same system in 43 star systems and never once been spotted while it was running. The camouflage was military grade, designed for hostile insertions and close quarters infiltration. It could fool thermal imaging, motion sensors, even high-end optical tracking systems. It could certainly fool a hallway full of elderly humans whose most advanced technology appeared to be a malfunctioning floor cleaner. Admiral Vance sat in the reading nook at the far end of the corridor, positioned in an armchair that had probably been there since the building's construction. He wore the same bathrobe from breakfast, the same reading glasses perched on his nose, and held the same physical newspaper he'd been working through all morning. The crossword was nearly complete now, just a few stubborn clues remaining. He hadn't looked up when Kahl dropped from the vent, hadn't acknowledged the sound of boots on hardwood, or the electronic hum of camouflage engaging. He simply sat there, reading an article about agricultural subsidies with the kind of focused attention that suggested he found crop rotation policies genuinely fascinating. His cane rested against the chair beside him, polished walnut gleaming in the morning sunlight that streamed through the hallway window. Kahl moved closer, each step calculated for minimal noise and maximum efficiency. 5 meters, 4, 3. Close enough now to see the age spots on Vance's hands, the slight tremor in his fingers as he turned the page. Close enough to read the headlines over the old man's shoulder. Vance still didn't look up. Kahl's tactical overlay suggested 2 optimal approach vectors. Continue past to the residential door, or neutralize the potential witness first. Logic dictated the former. Speed was paramount. The old man was focused on his newspaper, oblivious to the invisible threat passing within arm's reach. But something about the situation bothered Kahl on a level his threat assessment software couldn't quantify. The reading nook was positioned with clear sightlines down the entire corridor. Anyone sitting there could observe both the vent access point and the residential wing door. It was, coincidentally or not, the perfect overwatch position for someone monitoring access to the residential wing. And Admiral Vance, former Grand Admiral of the 3rd Expansion Fleet, tactical genius, the man who'd held impossible positions against overwhelming odds, just happened to be sitting there at 8:15 in the morning, reading the agricultural section of the newspaper. Not the military news, not the political analysis. Agricultural subsidies and crop rotation policies. Kahl ran the probability calculations. Coincidence versus deliberate positioning. The numbers came back inconclusive. His suit's behavioral analysis software flagged Vance's body language as non-threatening, elderly civilian at rest. Heart rate was elevated slightly, but within normal parameters for a 91-year-old man. Muscle tension minimal. No indicators of combat awareness or tactical alertness. The old man was exactly what he appeared to be. Someone reading a newspaper in a comfortable chair, oblivious to the world around him. Except for the reading nook's position. Except for the timing. Except for the fact that Vance had chosen to sit in this specific chair, at this specific time, in this specific corridor that Kahl needed to traverse to reach his targets. Kahl stopped 2 meters from the chair. His camouflage was holding perfectly. His thermal signature was masked behind suit cooling systems that redistributed body heat across a wider surface area. His electromagnetic output was dampened to background levels, indistinguishable from the building's ambient electrical systems. Every piece of expensive hardware confirmed that he was invisible, undetectable, a ghost in the machine. He could continue past. The residential door was only 8 meters beyond Vance's position. 10 seconds of careful movement and he'd be through, leaving the old man to his crossword puzzle and agricultural news. Or he could neutralize the witness. One hand over the mouth, one quick twist. A body that would be discovered hours later by staff who'd assume natural causes. Vance was 91. People that age died in their sleep all the time. It would delay the mission by perhaps 2 minutes, but it would eliminate a potential complication. Kahl's hand drifted toward the knife sheathed at his thigh. The blade was ceramic, undetectable by standard scanners, sharp enough to separate vertebrae with minimal force. Clean, quiet, professional. Vance turned another page with a soft rustle of paper. His pen moved across the crossword grid, filling in letters with the careful penmanship of someone who'd learned to write before digital interfaces existed. He was working on the bottom right corner now, squinting slightly at the smaller print, completely unaware of the invisible predator standing 2 meters away, calculating the biomechanics of his death. Vance turned another page with a soft rustle of paper. Then, without looking up, without any indication that he was aware of Kahl's presence, Admiral Vance reached up and adjusted the dial on his hearing aid. A small beige device tucked behind his right ear, the kind of medical appliance that had been helping the hard of hearing for over 2 centuries. Analog technology. Simple. Harmless. The sound started as a whisper, a high-pitched tone at the very edge of audible range. The kind of feedback screech that old electronics sometimes produced, annoying but ultimately ignorable. Then it ramped up. The pitch climbed in frequency and volume, passing from annoying to painful to absolutely unbearable in the span of half a second. But the pain wasn't the problem. Pain Kahl could handle. Pain was something his suit's medical systems could compensate for, with targeted nerve blocks and pharmaceutical intervention. The problem was that the sound wasn't following normal acoustic rules. It was hitting frequencies that shouldn't exist in normal sound propagation. wavelengths that interfered with electromagnetic fields in ways that analog noise shouldn't be capable of. Kahl's suit registered the anomaly immediately. The sound was creating standing waves that destructively interfered with the phase-locked loops maintaining his camouflage coherence. Destructive interference, harmonic resonance, the kind of phenomenon that required precise frequency generation and deliberate targeting, not the accidental feedback of malfunctioning medical equipment. His active camouflage system tried to compensate, cycling through alternative wavelengths to find one the interference couldn't reach. But for every adjustment it made, the hearing aid's output shifted to match, staying locked on the exact frequencies that would cause maximum disruption. The system was tracking his camouflage adaptations in real time and countering them faster than his suit's processors could generate new solutions. It was impossible. The kind of adaptive countermeasure that required dedicated military-grade signal processing and targeting systems, not a cheap hearing aid worn by an elderly man reading the newspaper. The camouflage flickered, once, twice. Visual artifacts bloomed across his suit's surface as the optical system struggled to maintain coherence against interference they weren't designed to handle. Then it collapsed entirely. The failure cascaded across multiple systems simultaneously. Optical camouflage offline. Sensor recalibration required. Audio dampening compromised. Electromagnetic shielding fluctuating. His HUD filled with red error messages, warnings about harmonic interference and system integrity failures, diagnostic reports that all concluded with the same assessment: unable to compensate. Kahl clutched at his helmet, fingers scrabbling for the audio control interface even as his suit's automated countermeasures tried and failed to filter out the piercing screech. The sound had found resonant frequencies in his suit's structure itself, turning 40 million credits of advanced engineering into a tuning fork that vibrated at exactly the wrong pitch. Through the noise and the system failures and the sudden terrible visibility, he heard Admiral Vance sigh with the weary patience of a man dealing with minor technical difficulties. The kind of sigh that suggested this wasn't the first time his hearing aid had acted up, and probably wouldn't be the last. "Damn tinnitus is acting up again," Vance said, still not looking up from his newspaper. His tone was conversational, mildly annoyed, the voice of someone commenting on unreliable old hardware. "Must be the humidity, or the cheap stealth suit in the hallway." The hearing aid's dial clicked one more notch. The frequency shifted, found a new resonance that made Kahl's teeth ache and his vision swim. His suit's audio systems, designed to handle everything from explosive overpressure to directed sonic weapons, simply gave up and cut to emergency passive mode. Silence crashed down like a physical weight, broken only by the ringing in Kahl's ears and the faint rustle of newspaper pages. Kahl stood in the middle of the hallway, fully visible, his camouflage system still flashing error messages across his HUD. Optical system failure, sensor recalibration required, harmonic interference detected, unable to compensate. His suit's reconstruction protocols estimated 12 minutes to restore camouflage functionality, 12 minutes of being visible, exposed, vulnerable. 12 minutes during which Admiral Vance sat in his reading nook and continued working on his crossword puzzle as if nothing had happened, as if a fully armored assassin wasn't standing 6 feet away, rendered visible by what amounted to a hearing aid that had stopped being a simple medical device somewhere around the time the warranty expired. Vance turned a page of his newspaper with a soft rustle. His pen moved across the crossword grid with careful, precise strokes. He didn't look up, didn't acknowledge Kahl's presence, didn't call for help or sound an alarm. He just sat there reading about agricultural subsidies and working through crossword clues, while Kahl's tactical software tried and failed to make sense of what had just happened. The cane rested against the armrest of Vance's chair, polished walnut gleaming in the morning sunlight. The old man reached over without looking, adjusted its position slightly, and tapped it once against the floor. A single, deliberate knock that resonated through the hardwood with a hollow thunk. A signal that traveled through the building's structure in ways wireless systems never could. In the dining room 2 floors below, Admiral Holloway looked up from her tablet and smiled. Vance set down his pen and picked up his coffee cup, taking a slow sip before returning his attention to 38 across. His hearing aid, that small beige device tucked behind his right ear, sat innocently in place. Just another piece of medical equipment helping an elderly man navigate the challenges of age-related hearing loss. The dial, currently set to position 4, didn't move. Kahl's hand went to his sidearm, muscle memory overriding the ringing in his ears and the shock of system failure. His fingers closed around the grip, familiar weight and balance providing the kind of physical certainty that his compromised electronics could no longer offer. The weapon was a masterwork of compact lethality. Magnetically accelerated projectiles, zero muzzle flash, subsonic velocity to avoid sonic signatures. He could put 3 rounds through Vance's skull before the old man finished filling in his crossword clue. End the threat, eliminate the witness, resume the mission with one less complication. Except Vance wasn't acting like a witness who needed eliminating. He was acting like someone who dealt with far more dangerous things than invisible assassins and found them mildly inconvenient at worst. The kind of calm that came from absolute confidence in one's position. And if the hearing aid was a weapon disguised as a medical device, what else in this building had been camouflaged as something harmless? What other traps were waiting, hidden behind facades of rust and obsolescence and elderly frailty? Kahl's tactical training had no protocols for this situation. No contingencies for targets who defended themselves with weaponized tinnitus and treated assassination attempts like minor interruptions to their morning routine. Admiral Vance filled in another crossword answer and took another sip of coffee. He still hadn't looked up, and somehow that was more terrifying than any direct threat could have been. Chapter 4. Gravity check. 12 minutes to restore camouflage functionality felt like 12 hours. Kahl stood in the East Wing corridor, fully visible, while Admiral Vance worked on his crossword puzzle 6 meters away. The old man hadn't looked up since the hearing aid had crashed Kahl's optical systems. Hadn't called for help. Hadn't moved from his reading nook except to reach for his coffee cup, which he sipped with the kind of unhurried calm that suggested invisible assassins were roughly as interesting as the agricultural news. Kahl's tactical software was screaming at him to move. Every protocol, every training module, every hard-won lesson from 43 star systems said the same thing. When your camouflage fails, you relocate. Change position. Break line of sight. Deny the enemy a static target. But moving meant turning his back on Vance, and turning his back on Vance felt like the kind of mistake that would get him killed in ways his threat assessment software couldn't predict. Because the hearing aid wasn't the only thing in this building that had stopped being what it appeared to be. His hand remained on his sidearm, finger outside the trigger guard, weight balanced for a quick draw if the old man so much as twitched toward anything that looked remotely threatening. Which, given recent developments, could be literally anything. The coffee cup, the newspaper, the reading glasses, the decorative handrail running along the corridor wall. Everything was suspect now. Everything was potentially lethal. Vance filled in another crossword answer and set down his pen. He picked up his coffee cup, took a sip, and returned it to its saucer with a soft clink of ceramic on ceramic. The morning sunlight streaming through the hallway window caught the steam rising from the cup, turning it into translucent wisps that dissipated into nothing. Peaceful, domestic, completely non-threatening. Kahl's tactical overlay continued to flag Vance as non-hostile, elderly civilian. Heart rate elevated but stable. Muscle tension minimal. No indicators of combat readiness. The old man was exactly what he appeared to be. Someone enjoying a quiet morning with his newspaper and crossword puzzle. Except for the weaponized hearing aid and the pressure plate trap in the north hallway. And the fact that 6 elderly humans had set up a betting pool on Kahl's infiltration like it was Wednesday morning entertainment. The suit's reconstruction protocols ticked down. 11 minutes, 40 seconds remaining. Too long. Far too long to remain exposed in a corridor with an overwatch position occupied by someone who'd held impossible defensive positions against overwhelming odds. Kahl made his decision. He needed distance. He needed cover. He needed to get somewhere he could reboot his systems without worrying about what other medical devices might be aimed at his back. The East Wing corridor extended another 20 meters beyond Vance's reading nook, ending in a T-junction that his mapping software identified as leading to maintenance access on the left and a service stairwell on the right. Either option would break line of sight. Either option would give him the breathing room he needed to restore his tactical edge. He moved. Not running. Running suggested panic, and panic was the enemy of survival. Instead, he walked with the controlled efficiency of someone who'd made a tactical decision and was executing it with professional discipline. Quick steps, minimal noise, eyes tracking Vance for any indication the old man was about to do something that required immediate violent response. Vance turned another page of his newspaper. He was reading the economic section now, squinting at small print tables of trade statistics and commodity prices. His coffee steamed gently beside him. His cane rested against his chair, polished walnut catching the morning light. He didn't look up as Kahl passed his position, didn't acknowledge the armored figure moving past him at combat-ready speed. Just sat there, reading about grain futures and shipping rates like absolutely nothing unusual was happening. Kahl's situational awareness screamed that this was wrong. Targets didn't ignore armed intruders. Witnesses didn't casually read newspapers while someone in full tactical gear walked past them. This was a setup. This was bait. This was... He reached the T-junction without incident. His mapping software suggested the maintenance access. Smaller space, more cover, easier to defend while his systems rebooted. He turned left, moving into a narrower corridor lined with utility panels and junction boxes that suggested this was the building's infrastructure spine. Perfect. Exactly what he needed. The floor here was different from the main corridors. Instead of hardwood, it was industrial tile, the kind of high durability material meant to withstand heavy equipment and maintenance foot traffic. The walls were painted concrete block rather than decorative plaster. Exposed conduit ran along the ceiling, carrying power and data lines to various parts of the building. Functional, utilitarian, the kind of space where budget considerations outweighed aesthetics, and covered with a thin layer of dust that suggested maintenance staff didn't come through here very often. Which meant privacy, which meant safety. Kahl's threat assessment software scanned the corridor and found nothing alarming. No motion sensors, no cameras, no obvious traps. Just a maintenance hallway in an elderly care facility, exactly as boring and non-threatening as it should be. He moved deeper into the corridor, putting more distance between himself and Vance's line of sight. 10 meters, 15, 20. Far enough now that even if the old man stood up and looked around the corner, Kahl would have time to react. The decorative brass handrails from the main corridor continued here, mounted on both walls at standard height for accessibility. They looked old, showing the patina and wear marks of decades of use by residents who needed the support for balance and mobility. Functional medical safety equipment, required by building codes and insurance regulations. Kahl's hand brushed against one as he moved past, using it momentarily for balance while he checked his HUD. The brass was cool to the touch, slightly textured from age and oxidation, completely ordinary. His camouflage reconstruction protocols had stalled at 87%. The system was having trouble recalibrating after the harmonic interference, throwing errors about frequency instability and sensor coherence issues. It needed a full reboot, which meant shutting down and restarting the optical systems from scratch. 3 minutes of complete vulnerability, while the suit's processors cycled through their initialization sequence. 3 minutes he couldn't afford while standing in a corridor, exposed. He needed higher ground, needed an elevated position where he could watch approaches and have the advantage of gravity if someone tried to reach him. The ceiling here was at least 3 meters high, with exposed structural beams that would support his weight. Kahl engaged his suit's magnetic clamps, the powered assist systems that allowed vertical mobility on ferrous surfaces. Small electromagnets in his boots and gloves, strong enough to hold his full weight plus equipment against a metal wall or ceiling. Military-grade climbing gear that had let him scale starship hulls and infiltrate facilities with vertical architecture. He stepped onto the wall, feeling the magnetic clamps engage with a series of soft clicks. The pull was immediate and secure, magnetic fields locking onto the steel reinforcement inside the concrete blocks. He took another step, then another, walking up the wall with the confidence of someone who'd done this thousands of times before. The suit's gyroscopic stabilizers compensated for his shifting center of gravity, keeping his balance steady as he transitioned from floor to wall to ceiling. Within seconds, he was moving along the upper portion of the corridor, boot magnets clicking softly against the metal conduit and structural beams. From here, he had sight lines down both approaches and the tactical high ground. Perfect. He found a position where two support beams intersected, providing a stable platform, and began his suit's reboot sequence. His HUD flickered as systems shut down in controlled order, error messages scrolling past as each subsystem acknowledged the restart command. 3 minutes. Just 3 minutes of vulnerability, and then he'd have his camouflage back. He'd have his tactical edge restored, he'd be invisible again, and the old man with the weaponized hearing aid would become the target instead of the threat. In the basement 2 floors below, Admiral Holloway stood in what the building directory listed as the recreation workshop, but what she privately thought of as her hobby shop. The room was filled with the accumulated projects of 2 decades of retirement. A partially disassembled clock radio from the 1960s, a collection of vacuum tubes that probably belonged in a museum, and approximately 17 different ongoing experiments in making old things do new things. Her favorite project, the one she'd been working on since the building's last major electrical upgrade in 2168, sat against the far wall. A breaker panel that looked like it had been salvaged from a decommissioned warship, complete with heavy industrial switches labeled with fading marker. North wing, lights. South wing, HVAC. Kitchen, power. And her personal favorite, handrails, decorative. She reached for her tablet, checking the feed from the building's ancient CCTV system. The image quality was terrible, full of scan lines and analog distortion, but it was clear enough to show Kahl suspended from the ceiling of the East Wing maintenance corridor, magnetic clamps locked onto the structural beams. "Hobby shop to dining room," she said into her handheld radio, a device that had been state-of-the-art military communications equipment in approximately 2150. "Target is elevated. East Wing maintenance. Magnetic lock on ceiling infrastructure." Admiral Chen's voice crackled back through the speaker, distorted by decades of electronics degradation. "Confirmed. Holloway, you're cleared for magnetic field activation." "Roger that." Holloway set down the radio and studied the breaker panel. The handrail's decorative switch was currently in the off position, which was its normal state. In this state, the handrails throughout the building served their intended purpose, providing support and balance assistance for elderly residents. But when the switch was flipped to on, the handrails became something considerably less decorative. She wrapped her hand around the heavy industrial lever. The switch was rated for 500 amps at 480 volts, designed to handle power loads that would make modern circuit breakers look like children's toys. It took genuine physical effort to move, resistance fighting her all the way. Holloway pulled. The switch engaged with a sound like a bank vault closing, a deep metallic chunk that resonated through the building's structure. Somewhere in the walls, relay switches closed in sequence, routing power from the building's main electrical system to a network of electromagnets that had been carefully hidden inside what everyone assumed were decorative brass handrails. Industrial-grade electromagnets, the kind normally used in scrapyards to lift entire vehicles or in manufacturing plants to move steel plates weighing tons. Powered by the building's 3-phase electrical system and operating at field strengths that would make MRI machines look like refrigerator magnets. The handrails had always been brass-plated. It was the steel core underneath that nobody paid attention to. The magnetic field propagation was nearly instantaneous, electromagnetic force flooding through the handrail network at the speed of light. Every handrail in the building became an electromagnet strong enough to lift a small car. The floor plates beneath them, which also happened to contain steel reinforcement, experienced induced magnetism strong enough to matter. And Kahl's suit, constructed from advanced military alloys that included significant ferrous components for structural integrity, suddenly found itself in the presence of magnetic forces it had never been designed to handle. The pull was immediate and overwhelming. One moment, Kahl was suspended from the ceiling, magnetic clamps holding him securely to the structural beams while his suit rebooted. The next moment, every ferrous component in his armor experienced magnetic attraction strong enough to overcome his boot magnets, his gyroscopic stabilizers, and basic physics. His suit didn't fall. It slammed. The magnetic field grabbed his armor and yanked him sideways with enough force to tear his boot magnets free from the ceiling beams. He had perhaps 1/10 of a second to realize what was happening before he collided with the wall-mounted handrail at a velocity that would have been fatal without his suit's impact dampeners. The sound was a visceral thunk of metal meeting metal, followed immediately by the high-pitched whine of servos trying and failing to compensate for forces they weren't designed to handle. His suit's stabilization system screamed error messages as they attempted to calculate escape vectors from a situation that didn't have any. He was pinned, held flat against the wall by magnetic forces strong enough to make his armor groan under the stress. His chest plate, shoulder guards, even the reinforced sections of his helmet, anything with significant ferrous content, was being pulled toward the handrail with enough force to compress his rib cage and make breathing difficult. Kahl tried to move, found his limbs wouldn't respond. The suit's powered joints, designed to augment his strength, were fighting against magnetic fields strong enough to lift vehicles. The motors whined in protest, burning through power reserves at an alarming rate while achieving exactly zero actual movement. He was effectively a refrigerator magnet. 40 million credits of advanced military technology, reduced to a decorative object stuck to a wall. The building's intercom system crackled to life, with a burst of feedback whine that suggested the equipment was approximately as old as everything else in this facility. Admiral Holloway's voice came through, distorted by decades of electronics degradation, but still perfectly understandable. "Attention guests," she said, her tone carrying the kind of bureaucratic cheerfulness that belonged in customer service announcements. "The East Wing Magnetic Accessibility Assist System is experiencing a polarity malfunction. Electromagnetic handrails are currently operating at industrial load capacity. We apologize for any inconvenience. Please avoid ferrous materials and maintain distance from all brass fixtures until the system is recalibrated. Thank you for your patience." The intercom clicked off with another burst of feedback. Kahl hung against the wall, unable to move, barely able to breathe against the magnetic compression of his chest plate. His HUD showed a cascade of error messages scrolling past faster than he could read them. Magnetic interference, actuator overload, power drain critical, structural stress warning. His suit's power reserves, which had been at 73% when he'd entered the maintenance corridor, were dropping at a rate of approximately 2% per minute as every motor and servo in his armor fought a losing battle against industrial electromagnets. At this rate, he'd be at zero power in half an hour, and a suit without power was just very expensive dead weight. The reboot sequence, which had been at 45% completion when the magnets engaged, had frozen entirely. His optical camouflage systems were offline. His sensors were compromised. His communications were jammed, and he was pinned to a wall in a retirement home by what amounted to decorative handrails that had decided to become magnetic death traps. In the dining room 2 floors below, Admiral Chen set down his coffee cup and made a notation on the betting pool napkin. "East Wing Maintenance Corridor, 08 to 26. Magnetic capture successful." Holloway's voice crackled through the radio. "Diagnostics will take 30 minutes minimum. Building codes require full system recalibration before re-enabling normal function." "Very thorough," Chen replied. In the East Wing Maintenance Corridor, Vaxen Kal realized that he'd made a fundamental tactical error. He'd assumed the building's infrastructure was neutral ground, that the maintenance corridors were safe because they weren't visible to residents and didn't serve any obvious defensive purpose. He'd forgotten that Admiral Holloway had been chief of engineering for the Fifth Fleet, the woman who'd retrofitted entire battle groups mid-deployment, using nothing but spare parts and spite. The woman who'd once kept a dreadnought operational using components salvaged from cargo containers and improvised welding. To someone like Holloway, infrastructure wasn't neutral ground. Infrastructure was a weapons platform waiting to be activated, and the handrails, those innocent brass rails meant to help elderly residents maintain their balance, were now the bars of a prison cell he'd walked into voluntarily. Kahl's suit power dropped to 68%. The magnets hummed with patient industrial strength. And somewhere below, Admiral Holloway began her very thorough, very time-consuming diagnostic of the electromagnetic accessibility system that had absolutely nothing wrong with it. Chapter 5. Groundskeeping. 30 minutes pinned to a wall gives a man time to think. Kahl had spent the first 10 minutes trying every countermeasure his suit possessed. Electromagnetic pulse generators that would have fried civilian electronics but did nothing against industrial magnets operating on pure analog current. signal jammers that searched for wireless control systems that didn't exist. Even a localized EMP charge designed to create a brief magnetic null field, which succeeded only in draining another 8% of his suit's power reserves, while the handrail magnets continued humming with patient industrial strength. The second 10 minutes had been spent on diagnostics and damage assessment. His optical camouflage was still offline. His audio systems were compromised from the hearing aid attack. His suit's structural integrity was at 73% and declining under the constant magnetic stress, and his power reserves, which had been a comfortable 73% when he'd entered the maintenance corridor, were now at 52% and dropping. At this rate, he'd be at 0 power in 90 minutes, and a suit without power was just very expensive coffin. The third 10 minutes had been spent accepting what his tactical training had been screaming at him since the handrail magnets had slammed him into the wall. He wasn't getting out of this with his equipment intact. The suit was designed for infiltration, not for escaping industrial-grade electromagnetic traps in retirement home maintenance corridors, which meant he needed to stop thinking like an infiltrator and start thinking like a survivor. His suit's emergency systems included a manual override for the external armor plating, a last resort option designed for situations where the armor itself had become a liability rather than an asset. Explosive bolts built into the seams, small shaped charges that could separate the outer shell from the inner bodysuit in under 2 seconds. The manual warned that using this system would void the warranty, destroy the suit's structural integrity, and leave the operator exposed to environmental hazards, enemy fire, and social embarrassment. Kahl triggered it anyway. The explosions were small and precisely directed, shaped charges that blew the connecting bolts without fragmenting the armor plates themselves. But in the confined space of the maintenance corridor, they sounded like gunshots, sharp cracks that echoed off the concrete walls and ceiling. His chest plate separated first, falling away from his torso and clanging against the floor with the distinctive ring of expensive alloy meeting cheap tile. Then his shoulder guards, arm sections, leg plating, and helmet crown, each piece pulled toward the magnetized handrails where they stuck with solid metallic thunks. What remained was Kahl in a thin tactical bodysuit, the kind of underlayer designed for temperature regulation and biometric monitoring, not protection. No armor, no shielding, no helmet. Just a man in form-fitting black synthetic fabric, standing in a corridor full of his own discarded equipment. He felt naked, vulnerable, exposed in ways that had nothing to do with physical coverage and everything to do with the sudden absence of 40 million credits of military hardware between him and the universe. But he could move. The magnetic pull was still there, tugging at the ferrous components in his boots and the small metal fasteners on his bodysuit. But it was manageable now. Weak enough that he could pull away, could walk, could run if necessary. He stumbled toward the corridor exit, legs unsteady after 30 minutes of magnetic compression. His boots felt strange without the powered assist and stabilization systems. Just rubber and synthetic materials now, cheap athletic shoes masquerading as tactical gear. Behind him, his armor remained pinned to the wall like a museum display, a 40 million credit monument to tactical overconfidence. The atrium was 20 meters down the corridor and through a set of double doors marked Garden Access, Residents Only. Kahl hit the doors at a run, shouldering through them with more force than necessary, desperate for open space and the illusion of freedom that came with it. The garden greeted him with morning sunlight and the smell of soil. It was larger than he'd expected from the external architectural scans, a central courtyard that the building's wings wrapped around in a rough square. Real grass, not synthetic ground cover. Real trees, not decorative sculptures. Flower beds arranged in geometric precision around a central koi pond that probably did violate several health codes, but looked picturesque enough that nobody cared. Most importantly, it was outside. Open air. No corridors, no magnetic traps, no weaponized medical equipment hiding behind facades of harmless assistive technology. Kahl moved into the foliage, putting distance between himself and the building, using the landscaping for cover the way his training had taught him. Trees provided concealment. Bushes broke line of sight. The ornamental grasses were tall enough to hide a crouching man. His tactical instincts, stripped of electronic assistance and sensor overlays, fell back on fundamentals. Stay low, stay quiet, use natural cover. Trust your eyes and ears instead of hardware that could be compromised. The garden felt safe in a way the building hadn't. Natural, organic, impossible to weaponize because you couldn't turn flowers and grass into... Admiral Chen was kneeling beside a bonsai tree near the koi pond, pruning shears in hand, squinting at tiny branches with the kind of focused attention that suggested this was serious work. He wore gardening gloves, a wide-brimmed sun hat that had probably been stylish in 2140, and an expression of absolute serenity. He didn't look up when Kahl entered the garden, didn't acknowledge the sound of the double doors slamming open, or the noise of someone running across gravel paths in cheap tactical boots. Just continued his careful work, snipping branches with precise movements, occasionally tilting his head to examine the tree from different angles. Kahl froze behind a cluster of ornamental grasses, watching the old man work, trying to determine if this was coincidence or setup, random chance or tactical positioning. Chen set down his pruning shears and picked up a small watering can, gently moistening the soil around the bonsai's roots. His hands were steady despite their age, movements economical and practiced. A hobbyist pursuing his craft with the dedication of someone who had all the time in the world and nowhere else to be. The koi pond beside him rippled with movement as fish circled beneath the surface, orange and white shapes gliding through water that was probably clearer than it had any right to be. The pond's filtration system hummed softly, a background noise that suggested regular maintenance and careful upkeep. Peaceful, domestic, completely non-threatening. Except Admiral Chen had been drone fleet commander for the 5th Fleet, the man who'd coordinated swarm tactics across 3 battle groups, managing thousands of autonomous units simultaneously. The kind of tactical mind that could track multiple targets across complex 3-dimensional battle spaces. And he was kneeling in a garden, pruning a bonsai tree, while an intruder crouched 15 meters away in the ornamental grasses. Kahl's hand went to his sidearm, the only piece of equipment he'd retained after abandoning his armor. The weapon felt heavier without the suit's powered assist, but it was still functional, still lethal, still capable of putting 3 rounds through an elderly man's skull before he finished examining his tree. Chen picked up his pruning shears again, studying a particular branch. "A little off the top, I think," he said conversationally, though whether he was talking to the tree or to himself or to someone else entirely wasn't clear. The pruning shears made a soft snipping sound as they cut through the branch, and somewhere in the garden, something responded with a high-pitched whine that sounded like a mosquito the size of a small dog. The groundskeeping drones had been installed in 2165 as part of the facility's automation upgrade. Small autonomous units designed to handle routine maintenance tasks that were too tedious for human staff and too regular to justify hiring outside contractors. Lawn mowing, weed trimming, leaf collection, debris removal. The manufacturer's documentation described them as efficient, eco-friendly, and safe for use in residential environments. What the documentation didn't mention, because it predated the current ownership by about 20 years, was that Admiral Holloway had performed minor modifications to the control systems and cutting implements shortly after installation. The drones emerged from their charging stations hidden beneath decorative shrubs, tracked units roughly the size of large dinner plates, painted in a shade of green that blended with the grass. Their cutting blades, which should have been dull rotary mowers designed for safety, had been replaced with monofilament wire spinning at speeds that made them effectively invisible, the kind of cutting implements that could slice through plant stems, woody branches, or human ankles with equal efficiency. There were 6 of them. They moved across the grass with the purposeful efficiency of hunting insects, motors whining at frequencies just on the edge of audible range. Not the gentle hum of domestic lawn equipment, but the aggressive whine of something designed for maximum cutting speed. Kahl heard them before he saw them. That mosquito whine rising in pitch as they accelerated, triangulating on his position through sensors that had been tuned to detect heat signatures, movement patterns, and, if Holloway's modifications were as thorough as her previous work suggested, biological mass that didn't belong in the garden's carefully curated ecosystem. He was, from the drone's perspective, a very large weed that needed removing. The first drone broke cover from behind a cluster of hostas, monofilament cutter creating a visible distortion in the air as it spun. The targeting system, such as it was, locked onto the thermal differential between Kahl's body heat and the surrounding vegetation. The drone accelerated toward his ankle at a speed that suggested its governor had been disabled along with its safety protocols. Kahl dove sideways, rolling across gravel that would have been painful without his armor's impact protection. The drone shot past his previous position, monofilament cutter missing his leg by perhaps 10 centimeters. It corrected course with the kind of responsiveness that suggested military-grade control systems hiding under a housing marked GreenTech Automo Series 4. Two more drones emerged from the flower beds, approaching from different angles. Not random patrol patterns, but coordinated flanking maneuvers, cutting off retreat vectors and forcing Kahl into a diminishing area of maneuverable space. He drew his sidearm and put 2 rounds into the nearest drone. The impacts punched through the lightweight housing, shattering whatever passed for its central processor. The drone executed a hard right turn, plowed into a bed of petunias, and went still, monofilament cutter winding down with a descending whine. The remaining 5 drones adjusted their approach vectors, moving faster now, closing the distance with mechanical determination. Admiral Chen continued pruning his bonsai tree, occasionally glancing at the carnage in his peripheral vision, but never directly looking at either Kahl or the drones trying to convert him into mulch. He made another careful cut, examined the result, and nodded with satisfaction. "Take out the trash in Sector 4, he said quietly, still apparently addressing the tree. The drone's whine increased in pitch. Their motors pushed into higher RPMs, cutting blades spinning fast enough to create visible vortices in the morning air. They didn't have weapons in any conventional sense, just groundskeeping equipment operating at specifications that would have violated multiple safety regulations if anyone from the county inspector's office had bothered to check. Which, given what had happened to the last county inspector who'd tried to schedule a visit, seemed unlikely to occur anytime soon. Kahl fired 3 more rounds, destroying a second drone and damaging a third enough that its navigation became erratic. It spun in circles for a few seconds before diving into the koi pond, where it sank with a stream of bubbles and a faint electrical crackling. The fish scattered to the far end of the pond. Chen frowned slightly as if concerned about their stress levels. 4 drones remained. They adjusted tactics, spreading wider, forcing Kahl to track multiple targets simultaneously. Without his helmet's targeting assist and threat overlay, he was relying on basic marksmanship and situational awareness, both of which were being tested by small robots that moved like caffeinated predators. His bodysuit wasn't rated for monofilament impacts. One good hit would separate flesh from bone with the kind of efficiency that made surgical tools look clumsy. He needed distance, needed cover, needed anything that would slow down the relentless advance of automated gardening equipment that had been repurposed into the world's most absurd weapon system. The garden's central fountain offered the only hardcover visible. Kahl ran for it, boots sliding on wet grass, legs burning from exertion without his suit's muscle augmentation. Behind him, the drones followed, their whine creating a discordant harmony as they closed the distance. He made it to the fountain with perhaps 2 seconds to spare, putting decorative stonework between himself and the pursuing drones. Water sprayed from a central sculpture that appeared to depict either an abstract representation of peace and tranquility, or possibly someone's interpretation of a squid. It was hard to tell. The drones circled the fountain, seeking approach angles, their sensors tracking his thermal signature through the stonework. They didn't have enough processing power to understand cover and concealment in any sophisticated sense, but they were very good at identifying target locations and plotting intercept courses. Kahl checked his ammunition. 7 rounds remaining, 4 drones still operational. Basic mathematics suggested this was going to be close. Admiral Chen finished with his bonsai tree and stood up with the careful deliberation of someone whose knees required negotiation with gravity. He brushed soil from his gardening gloves, removed his sun hat, and walked toward the koi pond to check on the fish that had been disturbed by the drowning drone. He didn't look at Kahl, didn't acknowledge the gunfire or the mechanical carnage, or the fact that his garden was currently serving as an arena for a desperate close-quarters battle between a half-armored assassin and automated lawn maintenance equipment. He just stood at the pond's edge, making soft clicking sounds with his tongue, encouraging the fish to return to their normal patrol patterns around the pond's perimeter. The drones continued their patient circulation around the fountain, motors whining, waiting for their target to make a mistake. And somewhere in the building behind them, Admiral Holloway made a notation on her tablet. Garden engagement, 09 to 15. Chen groundskeeping modifications performing as designed. Chapter 6. The Shuffleboard calculation. 7 rounds, 4 drones, mathematics that didn't favor survival. Kahl had been pinned behind the fountain for 3 minutes, watching the groundskeeping drones circle with the patient efficiency of automated predators. They didn't get tired, didn't get impatient, didn't need to breathe or think or second-guess their programming. They just maintained their perimeter, monofilament cutters spinning at speeds that made the air shimmer, waiting for their target to make a mistake. The building's west entrance was 12 meters away, across open grass with 0 cover. The drone's sensors would track his thermal signature before he covered half that distance, and without his armor's speed enhancement, he'd be running on biological muscle alone, which meant approximately 8 meters per second if he was lucky. Basic physics said the drones would reach him in 6 seconds. His ammunition said he might drop 2 of them before the other 2 reached his ankles. The mathematics were straightforward and deeply unpleasant. Admiral Chen had finished checking on his koi fish and was now examining a rosebush near the pond's edge, pruning shears in hand, completely absorbed in his work. The gunfire, the drone carnage, the assassin trapped behind decorative stonework, none of it warranted acknowledgement beyond the occasional glance that might have been concern for his petunias. Kahl made his decision. He had 3 rounds more than he needed for a fighting retreat, which meant 3 chances to create an opening. He marked his targets, calculated their intercept vectors, and prepared for the kind of running firefight that usually ended with someone bleeding on the ground. The west entrance was his only option. Whatever was inside the building couldn't be worse than staying pinned in a garden while lawn equipment slowly outlasted his ammunition supply. He broke cover at a full sprint, firing as he moved. 2 rounds into the nearest drone, destroying its housing and sending it into a terminal spin. The remaining 3 adjusted instantly, motors whining as they accelerated toward his new position. Kahl didn't stop to confirm the kill. He ran, boots pounding grass, legs burning without his suit's augmentation. 8 meters. 7. The drones were closing, their cutting systems creating visible vortexes as they tracked his thermal signature. 6 meters. 5. He fired again, catching the second drone mid-approach. It tumbled into a flower bed, monofilament cutter carving a divot in the soil before the motor seized. 4 meters. 3. The final 2 drones were too close now, almost within cutting range. He could hear the high-pitched whine of their motors, feel the displaced air from their spinning blades. 2 meters. He dove through the doorway, rolling across tile flooring that was considerably less forgiving than his armor had been. The drones hit the threshold and stopped, their programming apparently including instructions not to pursue targets into interior spaces. Or possibly Chen had just whistled a recall command while examining his roses. It was hard to tell. Kahl scrambled to his feet, breathing hard, and slammed the door shut. Through the glass panel he could see the 2 surviving drones executing slow patrol patterns around the entrance, waiting with mechanical patience for him to make another mistake. The recreation room stretched before him, a space dedicated to the kind of low-impact entertainment that retirement facilities specialized in. Card tables arranged in neat rows, a bookshelf full of large print novels and crossword puzzle compilations, a television from an era when screens were measured in thickness rather than thinness, and along the far wall, a shuffleboard court, its polished wooden surface gleaming under fluorescent lights that hummed with the distinctive frequency of magnetic ballasts. Admiral Vance stood at one end of the shuffleboard court, studying the layout with the kind of focused attention most people reserved for important decisions. He wore the same bathrobe from earlier, the same reading glasses, and held a shuffleboard cue like it was an extension of his arm rather than a piece of recreational equipment. He didn't look up when Kahl entered, didn't acknowledge the sound of the door slamming or the heavy breathing of someone who'd just survived automated lawn equipment through superior firepower and desperation. He simply lined up his shot, squinting at angles only he could see. The shuffleboard court was regulation size, 10 meters of polished wood with scoring zones marked in faded paint. 3 pucks sat in play, 2 red and 1 yellow, positioned in what appeared to be a casual game's mid-state. The scoring pattern suggested someone losing badly or possibly just playing both sides against himself. Kahl moved along the room's perimeter, putting distance between himself and the garden entrance, using the card tables for cover. His tactical instincts, stripped of electronic assistance, fell back on basics: concealment, observation, assessment of threats and opportunities. The recreation room had 3 exits. The garden entrance behind him, now watched by patient drones. A door marked "Kitchen, Staff Only" on the east wall, and a corridor leading deeper into the building's interior on the north side. All 3 offered escape routes, but all 3 required crossing open floor space where an elderly man with unknown capabilities had clear sight lines. Vance took his shot. The puck slid across the polished wood with a soft hiss, traveling in a perfectly straight line that suggested either exceptional skill or dumb luck. It stopped in the 10-point zone, settled there with geometric precision, and went still. He marked something on a small chalkboard mounted beside the court, updating scores with careful penmanship. The chalk made soft scratching sounds against the board's surface. Kahl circled toward the kitchen door, staying low, using furniture as concealment. His remaining ammunition was 3 rounds. Not enough for a sustained engagement, but enough for immediate threat neutralization if the old man reached for anything resembling a weapon, which, given recent experience, could be literally anything. The shuffleboard cue, the chalkboard, the reading glasses, everything was potentially lethal until proven otherwise. He was 6 meters from the kitchen door when he realized Vance wasn't looking at the shuffleboard court. The old man's eyes were focused on something else entirely: the brass trophy case mounted on the west wall, its glass front reflecting the room's interior at an angle that included Kahl's position behind the card tables. Mirror tactics, using reflective surfaces for indirect observation. The kind of basic surveillance technique that predated electronic sensors by several thousand years and still worked because people forgot to check reflections. Kahl froze, recognizing the tactical error even as he made it. Vance knew exactly where he was. Had probably known since the moment he'd entered the room. Was tracking his movement through the trophy case's reflection while appearing to focus on a recreational game that suddenly seemed considerably less recreational. Vance picked up another puck, the blue one, and rolled it between his fingers with the casual familiarity of someone who'd handled similar objects thousands of times. He positioned himself at the shuffleboard court's head, feet planted in a stance that would have looked at home on a firing range, and studied the angles. Not the angles of the court itself, Kahl realized. The angles in the trophy case's reflection. Calculating vectors, intercepts, ricochet trajectories. The old man was lining up a bank shot using a mirror to aim at a target 12 meters away behind furniture. Vance's eyes narrowed behind his reading glasses. His lips moved silently, forming numbers or equations, or possibly just counting to himself the way people did when calculating complex mathematics without digital assistance. His hand adjusted the cue's position by millimeters, fine-tuning the angle with microscopic precision. Then he struck the puck. The sound was wrong, not the gentle push of recreational shuffleboard, but a sharp crack, like a cue ball in billiards or possibly a small caliber gunshot. The puck launched across the court at a velocity that made Kahl's threat assessment software, if he'd still had it, scream about kinetic weapons and impact hazards. It hit the far bumper at precisely 7 degrees off perpendicular, exactly as physics demanded for the trajectory Vance had calculated. The impact didn't slow it down so much as redirect it, sending the puck careening off at a new vector toward the west wall. Second impact. The puck bounced off a brass mounting bracket for a decorative banner, changing direction again with mathematical precision. The bracket rang like a small bell, a pure note that suggested excellent metallic properties. Third impact. The edge of a window frame, barely clipping it, adjusting the trajectory by perhaps 2 degrees. Enough to matter. Enough to be deliberate. Kahl watched the puck complete its geometric journey across the room and realized, with the kind of clarity that comes from recognizing inevitable doom, that it was going to hit the fire suppression pipe directly above his position. Not near it, not approximately close to it. Exactly on the connection joint where age and corrosion had weakened the metal to the point where sufficient impact force would cause catastrophic structural failure. He tried to move, started to roll left toward different cover, away from the targeting solution that Vance had calculated using nothing but reflections and recreational equipment. The puck hit the pipe joint with a metallic clang that suggested Vance had underestimated neither the force required nor the structural weakness of 1960s plumbing. The pipe separated. Not cleanly, not with the kind of precision that modern engineering would demand, but with the sudden catastrophic failure that happens when something old and corroded finally gives up and accepts its fate. What emerged from the pipe was not water. The fire suppression system at Serene Vistas had been upgraded in 2163 after an incident involving a malfunctioning toaster, and Admiral O'Malley's vigorous use of a fire extinguisher that had somehow made the situation worse. The new system used chemical foam, the kind designed for electrical fires and situations where water would cause more problems than it solved. The chemical composition was proprietary, meaning nobody outside the manufacturer knew exactly what was in it. But the material safety data sheet suggested it was safe for residential use and non-toxic when properly applied. What the MSDS didn't mention, possibly because it had been edited by Admiral Holloway during installation, was that the foam hardened on contact with organic material. Not slowly, not gradually, but with the kind of rapid polymerization that normally required specialized industrial adhesives and careful mixing ratios. The foam hit Kahl with the force of a broken pipe under pressure, covering him in a expanding chemical mass that smelled like burning plastic and felt like warm gelatin. He had perhaps 2 seconds to realize what was happening before the foam began its transition from liquid to solid. The hardening started at his shoulders, where the initial spray had concentrated, and spread outward with inexorable chemical logic. His arms locked in place, his legs became immobile, his chest restricted, limiting breathing to shallow gasps that suggested he had maybe 3 minutes before the foam's expansion compressed his ribs enough to cause serious medical concerns. He was encased, mummified, trapped in chemical foam that had gone from liquid to solid in under 10 seconds, creating what was effectively a full-body cast of polymerized industrial adhesive. Through the rapidly hardening foam covering his face, he could see Admiral Vance walking over to the chalkboard, chalk in hand. The old man made a mark, a simple X in the corner where apparently successful shots were recorded, and set the chalk down with the satisfied air of someone who'd completed a difficult task competently. "Bank shot," Vance said, more to himself than to anyone else. His tone was conversational, the same voice he'd used for crossword puzzles and agricultural news. 7 degrees off the starboard bumper, nothing but net. He picked up his shuffleboard cue and returned it to the rack mounted on the wall, handling it with the care of someone who'd learned to maintain equipment during a career that predated disposable anything. The cue settled into its holder with a soft click. Vance walked past Kahl's foam-encased form without looking directly at it, the same way someone might walk past an interesting piece of furniture that wasn't quite ready for use. His cane tapped against the floor with that familiar hollow rhythm, each step measured and deliberate. He paused at the door to the interior corridor, hand on the frame, and glanced back at the shuffleboard court, checking his work perhaps, verifying the angles, making sure the shot had landed exactly where his calculations had predicted. The foam around Kahl continued its polymerization, pressure increasing against his chest, breathing becoming more difficult with each passing second. His vision narrowed to a tunnel, then to fragments, then to nothing but the awareness of being trapped in darkness, while somewhere nearby an old man in a bathrobe evaluated the quality of his recreational geometry. Vance's footsteps receded down the corridor, the tapping of his cane fading into the distance. In the garden, Admiral Chen finished pruning his roses and made a soft clicking sound with his tongue. The 2 surviving drones powered down their cutting systems and returned to their charging stations beneath the decorative shrubs, mission complete, ready for tomorrow's maintenance schedule. And in the recreation room, Vaxen Kal discovered that there were worse things than being shot, worse things than being trapped by magnets, worse things than being hunted by autonomous lawn equipment. Being defeated by Shuffleboard was considerably more humiliating than any of those options. The foam finished hardening at 09:47 a.m., creating what Admiral Holloway would later describe in her maintenance log as unscheduled occupancy of recreation room by statuary of unknown origin. The insurance claim would be filed under plumbing malfunction rather than tactical bank shot, because documentation mattered and certain details didn't need to be public record. Chapter 7. Oxygen Therapy. The ventilation system had always been Kahl's retreat when things went wrong. Tight spaces favored the smaller combatant. Confined environments neutralized numerical advantages. And most importantly, building maintenance infrastructure was usually the last thing anyone thought to weaponize because it served essential life support functions that couldn't be interrupted without killing everyone inside. That logic had held true across 43 star systems and countless contracts. Air ducts were neutral ground, safe havens when surface routes became compromised. Admiral Holloway was teaching him that this assumption, like so many others he'd made about serene vistas, had been dangerously optimistic. Kahl pulled himself into the vent access panel on the East Wing's second floor, arms burning from exertion without his suit's powered assist. The bodysuit he'd been left with after abandoning his armor provided exactly zero enhancement to his physical capabilities. Just synthetic fabric that wicked sweat and did absolutely nothing to make climbing easier. The vent shaft stretched ahead into darkness, illuminated only by the faint emergency lighting that marked junction points every 10 meters. The air moving through the system was cool and dry, carrying the faint smell of old dust and machine oil. Familiar, almost comforting in its mundane normalcy. He'd lost the garden drones by retreating into the building through a ground floor maintenance access, leaving Chen to his bonsai pruning and the fish to their stress recovery. The drones, designed for outdoor terrain, had stopped at the threshold with the confused determination of automated systems encountering parameters outside their programming. Small mercies. Kahl would take those where he could find them. His tactical situation had degraded from compromised to catastrophic over the course of 90 minutes. No armor, no camouflage, no helmet sensors or targeting overlays. Just a sidearm with 4 rounds remaining, a bodysuit that would stop exactly nothing, and the growing certainty that every system in this building had been modified to kill him in ways that violated multiple safety regulations. The ventilation shaft offered what he needed most: time to think and distance from ground-level threats. The Admirals were elderly. They weren't climbing into ductwork to pursue him. They'd have to rely on remote systems, automated defenses, things he could potentially evade or disable if he stayed mobile. He crawled deeper into the ventilation network, following the airflow toward what his mental map suggested was the central HVAC system. Every building had a heart, a mechanical core where air was processed and distributed. Find that, and he could potentially use the access routes to reach the residential wing from above, bypassing whatever additional traps the corridors held. The shaft branched at a T-junction. Left led deeper into the building's infrastructure, toward the mechanical spaces where the environmental systems lived. Right curved back toward the occupied areas, residential corridors and common spaces. Kahl chose left, deeper into the machine, away from people, away from potential contact. The ductwork here was older, showing patches of rust and decades of accumulated dust that the cleaning systems had never quite reached. Industrial-grade metal construction, probably original to the building's 2140s foundation, built to last in an era when planned obsolescence wasn't yet standard business practice. The air moving past him shifted, became warmer and more humid. He was getting close to the HVAC core, where air was heated, cooled, filtered, and pushed through the building's circulatory system. A vast mechanical lung that breathed for several hundred tons of concrete and steel. The shaft opened into a larger junction chamber, a space where multiple ducts converged before routing to different zones. Perhaps 3 meters across, tall enough to crouch in, with access panels marked in fading stenciled letters. North Wing, 3B, South Wing, 4A, Central, Main. Kahl stopped in the chamber, catching his breath, listening to the building breathe around him. The fans were distant thrums, the airflow a constant whisper, the metal creaking slightly as temperature differentials caused expansion and contraction. Peaceful, in an industrial sort of way. The kind of mechanical ambience that suggested systems operating as designed, performing their functions without drama or complication. His instincts, which had been screaming warnings since the hearing aid incident, suggested this was the perfect time for something terrible to happen. Admiral Holloway stood in her basement workshop, studying a bank of monitors that displayed pressure readings, airflow velocities, and temperature differentials across the building's entire HVAC network. The screens were old cathode ray tubes, the kind that had been obsolete for 50 years, but which Holloway refused to replace because they still work and I understand them. One particular screen showed Duct 3B, the East Wing's primary air return. The pressure differential was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, but wrong enough to suggest something was blocking normal airflow. Something large, something biological. She reached for her handheld radio. Workshop to dining room. Target is in the ventilation system. Junction 3B, East Wing Core. Admiral Chen's voice crackled back through decades of electronic degradation. Confirmed. Recommend air quality intervention. Affirmative. The ducts are overdue for sanitization anyway. Holloway set down the radio and turned to a control panel that looked like it had been salvaged from a decommissioned industrial plant. Heavy switches labeled with masking tape and marker. Heating, main, cooling, zones, 1-4, filtration, standard, and most relevant to the current situation, deep clean sanitization protocol. The deep clean system had been installed during a mold outbreak in 21-68, after an unfortunate incident involving a leaking roof, inadequate ventilation, and the kind of toxic black mold that turned building inspections into hazmat operations. The solution had been a comprehensive duct sanitization system, intense ultraviolet radiation to sterilize surfaces, concentrated ozone to oxidize organic contaminants, and airflow reversal to purge the system of particulates. The manufacturer's specifications recommended running the deep clean cycle no more than once per quarter, for no longer than 15 minutes, with all building occupants notified in advance and residential areas sealed off. Holloway had modified the system to run at triple intensity with no automatic shutoff timer. Because if 15 minutes was good enough to kill mold, 45 minutes at higher power would be better. And if the manufacturer said triple intensity was unsafe for occupied buildings, well, the manufacturer had gone out of business in 2175 and couldn't really complain anymore. She wrapped her hand around the deep clean switch. It was the same heavy industrial lever as the handrail magnets, rated for power loads that modern circuit breakers wouldn't recognize. It took genuine physical effort to move. Holloway pulled. The switch engaged with that same bank vault chunk that resonated through the building's structure. Somewhere in the HVAC core, relay switches closed in sequence, routing power from the building's electrical system to a network of ultraviolet lamps and ozone generators that had been carefully hidden inside what everyone assumed were standard air filtration units. The UV lamps were industrial grade, the kind normally used in water treatment facilities and medical sterilization units. Wavelengths short enough to shred molecular bonds, intense enough to cause severe burns on exposed skin, and absolutely lethal to any microorganisms unfortunate enough to be exposed. The ozone generators were equally aggressive, creating concentrations of O3 that would make atmospheric chemists weep and safety inspectors resign on the spot. Ozone was an excellent oxidizer, wonderful for destroying organic compounds, and absolutely terrible for anyone trying to breathe it in concentrations above a few parts per million. The deep clean cycle activated with a rising hum that started at the edge of audibility and climbed into frequencies that made Holloway's teeth ache even through the workshop's concrete walls and soundproofing. In Junction 3B, Kahl noticed the change in air pressure first. The gentle breeze that had been flowing past him stuttered, reversed direction briefly, then went still. The kind of pressure shift that suggested valves closing, flow patterns redirecting, the building's mechanical lung changing its breathing rhythm. Then he noticed the smell, sharp, chemical, like the aftermath of lightning strikes or the ozone tang that came from overloaded electrical equipment. Not unpleasant in small doses, but getting stronger by the second, climbing from noticeable to concerning, to probably toxic in the span of perhaps 10 seconds. His eyes started watering, not from emotion but from chemical irritation as concentrated ozone began oxidizing the mucous membranes in his nose and throat. The kind of burning sensation that suggested his body was being exposed to things it really shouldn't be exposed to. Then the UV lamps engaged. Kahl had been in enough decontamination chambers and sterilization units to recognize UV radiation when he saw it. But those had been controlled environments, medical facilities with proper shielding and limited exposure times. This was different. This was every lamp in the duct system activating simultaneously, creating an intensity of ultraviolet light that would have violated every safety protocol ever written. The kind of radiation that could sterilize surgical equipment, destroy bacterial spores, and incidentally cook any organic tissue exposed to it. The air itself seemed to glow with a faint purple-blue luminescence, not because ozone was bioluminescent, but because the UV radiation was intense enough to cause fluorescence in the dust particles and atmospheric contaminants. The metal walls of the duct reflected and scattered the light, creating a surreal environment where every surface seemed to emit its own ghostly radiance. Kahl's exposed skin began burning immediately. Not the warmth of sunburn or the sting of minor irritation, but the deep tissue burn of serious radiation exposure. The bodysuit he wore provided some protection, but synthetic fabric wasn't designed to block ultraviolet light. Anywhere skin was exposed, his face, his hands, the back of his neck, started experiencing the kind of cellular damage normally associated with severe solar radiation or industrial accidents. His eyes, which he'd instinctively closed against the brightness, still registered pain as UV light penetrated his eyelids and began damaging the delicate tissues underneath. The sensation was like staring at the sun through a magnifying glass while someone threw sand in your face. He tried to breathe and got a lungful of ozone-saturated air that tasted like copper and electricity. His throat spasmed in protest, body recognizing toxin and trying to reject it. Coughing made it worse, drawing more contaminated air deeper into his lungs where the ozone could do maximum oxidative damage. The building's intercom system crackled to life, feedback whine cutting through the UV lamp hum and the sound of Kahl's labored breathing. Admiral Holloway's voice came through, maintaining that same bureaucratic cheerfulness she'd used for the magnetic accessibility announcement. Attention residents, the air quality index is registering elevated particulate levels. Building management will be running a deep clean sanitization cycle in the ventilation system for the next 30 minutes. Please remain in your residential units and keep all windows and doors closed. Thank you for your cooperation. The intercom clicked off. 30 minutes. Kahl's tactical assessment software, if he'd still had it, would have calculated his survival time at approximately 4, maybe 5 if he held his breath and minimized ozone exposure. The UV radiation alone would cause second-degree burns across all exposed skin in under 10 minutes. Longer exposure would mean third-degree burns, permanent eye damage, and cellular destruction at levels that wouldn't be immediately fatal, but would guarantee long-term complications. He needed out, needed to find a vent access, needed to reach breathable air, needed to escape the confined space that had become a sterilization chamber designed for mold spores, not humans. Kahl crawled back the way he'd come, eyes streaming tears that his body produced in desperate attempt to flush out UV damage, lungs burning with every breath. The ozone concentration made thinking difficult, oxygen deprivation causing lightheadedness and confusion that fought against his training. The vent shaft seemed longer than he remembered, distances stretched, perspective warped by pain and chemical exposure. Every meter required conscious effort, forcing limbs to move when his body wanted to curl into a ball and wait for the burning to stop. He found an access panel after what felt like hours but was probably closer to 2 minutes. His fingers, clumsy and unresponsive, fumbled with the emergency release. The mechanism was designed to open from inside the duct for exactly this kind of situation. Trapped maintenance workers, emergency evacuations, equipment failures. Holloway had welded it shut from the outside. Not obviously. The panel still moved, still gave the illusion of functionality, but the hinges had been spot welded at points invisible from inside the duct, creating a mechanism that appeared operational but would never actually open. Kahl hit the panel with his shoulder, desperation overriding pain. The welds held. Of course they held. Holloway had been engineering officer for a fleet. She knew how to make things stay together when they needed to stay together. He tried the next access panel. Welded. The third, welded. a pattern emerging that suggested every emergency exit in this section of the ductwork had been quietly, methodically disabled during some routine maintenance cycle that nobody had questioned because Admiral Holloway was very thorough about building safety. The UV lamps continued their patient work, radiation cooking his skin at wavelengths designed to shred molecular bonds. The ozone concentration climbed higher, reaching levels where oxidative damage to lung tissue became inevitable rather than probable. Kahl's vision began tunneling, peripheral awareness fading to a narrow focus on the duct ahead. Hypoxia combined with toxic exposure, brain struggling to maintain consciousness as oxygen levels dropped and cellular respiration became increasingly impaired. He crawled forward on instinct, no longer capable of tactical thinking or rational planning. Just movement, just forward progress, just the desperate animal need to escape confined spaces and find air that didn't burn. The duct opened into another junction chamber, this one with a larger access panel marked Maintenance, Primary. The kind of major access point designed for equipment servicing, large enough for a person to climb through, secured with heavy bolts instead of quick-release latches. Kahl's fingers found the first bolt, started turning. The metal was hot from UV exposure, burning his already damaged skin. He kept turning. Pain was information. Information could be processed later. Survival required ignoring information in favor of action. The bolt came free. He moved to the second, third, fourth, each rotation an achievement, each completed task a small victory against systems designed to kill him through atmospheric chemistry and electromagnetic radiation. The final bolt released. The access panel swung open on hinges that screamed from decades of no maintenance, revealing blessed normal air, room temperature atmosphere without chemical tang or purple glow. Kahl fell out of the ductwork and onto the floor of what his blurred vision suggested was a maintenance closet. Concrete floor, shelves of cleaning supplies, the overwhelming smell of industrial disinfectant mixing with his own burned skin, and the ozone still clinging to his bodysuit. He lay there, breathing air that didn't actively try to kill him, letting his body attempt to process the damage it had sustained. Second-degree burns across his face and hands, chemical burns in his throat and lungs. Eye damage that would require medical attention if he ever escaped this building alive. Behind him, through the open access panel, the ventilation system continued its deep clean cycle. UV lamps burning with patient intensity, ozone generators working to sterilize every surface, the building's mechanical lung breathing poison for another 26 minutes because the manufacturer's recommended cycle time was merely a suggestion. In her basement workshop, Admiral Holloway watched the pressure readings in Duct 3B return to normal. Target no longer blocking airflow. System operating as designed. She made a notation on her tablet. HVAC intervention, 1047. Sanitization cycle active. Air quality within acceptable parameters for building infrastructure. Then she flipped the deep clean switch back to the off position. Not because the cycle was complete. She'd said 30 minutes and meant 30 minutes, but because the target was no longer in the ducts and there was no point wasting electricity on empty spaces. Besides, the UV lamps would need time to cool down before the next activation. Equipment maintenance was important. You couldn't just run industrial systems at triple capacity without proper care and monitoring. That's how things broke. And Admiral Holloway didn't like it when things broke unless she'd specifically intended them to break for tactical purposes. She picked up her radio. Workshop to dining room. Target expelled from ventilation system. Chemical and radiation exposure confirmed. Probable location. Maintenance closet, second floor east. Acknowledged, Chen's voice crackled back. Should we send someone to check on him? No need. Let him rest. He's had a difficult morning. Holloway set down the radio and returned to the project she'd been working on before the interruption. Recalibrating the fire suppression system in the West Wing. The sprinkler heads there hadn't been tested in almost 6 months, and she'd recently acquired some interesting chemical compounds from a landscaping supplier that she wanted to experiment with. Waste not, want not. Wednesday mornings were for productive hobbies. Chapter 8. Visiting Hours. Pain had become Kahl's constant companion. The UV burns across his face and hands were the kind that would require specialized medical treatment. Synthetic skin grafts, cellular regeneration therapy, weeks of recovery in facilities designed for radiation exposure. His eyes, which he'd instinctively closed during the worst of the UV exposure, still felt like someone had filled them with sand and battery acid. Every blink was agony. Every attempt to focus made his vision swim with tears and afterimages. His lungs burned with each breath, ozone damage causing inflammation that made even shallow breathing feel like inhaling broken glass. The bodysuit had protected most of his torso, but anywhere skin had been exposed now carried the distinctive redness of serious radiation burns. And he still had 4 rounds in his sidearm, no armor, no backup, and no extraction plan beyond survive the next 5 minutes. The maintenance closet had offered temporary refuge, but refuge wasn't escape. He needed out, needed to reach an exit, needed to get beyond the building's perimeter, needed to put distance between himself and a retirement home that had systematically dismantled every tactical advantage he'd ever possessed. Kahl pulled himself to his feet, using a shelf of cleaning supplies for support. His legs were steady enough. The bodysuit had protected them from the worst of the UV exposure, but everything above his waist was a catalog of chemical and radiation damage. The closet's door opened onto a service corridor he didn't recognize from his infiltration mapping. Concrete walls painted institutional beige, fluorescent lighting that flickered with the irregular rhythm of aging ballasts, linoleum floor showing wear patterns from decades of foot traffic. Deeper into the building's infrastructure, maintenance spaces where residents never went, where the facade of comfort and care gave way to the mechanical reality of keeping elderly humans alive and comfortable. An infrastructure, as he'd learned repeatedly over the past 3 hours, was Admiral Holloway's natural habitat. Kahl moved down the corridor, one hand trailing the wall for support, the other resting on his sidearm. 4 rounds. He'd been keeping mental count since the garden drones. 4 chances to solve problems that couldn't be solved by running or hiding. The corridor branched. Left led toward what sounded like machinery, pumps, fans, the ambient hum of building systems. Right was quieter, showing signs of occasional foot traffic, scuff marks on the floor, a bulletin board with safety notices dated from 2173. He chose right. Machinery meant Holloway. Quiet meant potential access to systems he could manipulate. The corridor ended at a door marked "Communications Authorized Personnel Only," the kind of sign that had stopped meaning anything around 2160 when building security became more about liability than actual access control. Kahl tried the handle. Locked. But not electronically. Just a simple mechanical deadbolt, the kind that had been securing doors since before digital systems existed. His lockpicks had been in his armor, which was currently decorating a wall in the East Wing maintenance corridor. He considered shooting the lock, decided against it. 4 rounds. Saved them for problems that couldn't be solved with improvisation. The door frame was old wood, original construction, weakened by decades of humidity and temperature cycling. Kahl put his shoulder against it, ignored the protests from his burned skin, and pushed. The frame splintered on the 3rd impact, deadbolt tearing free from wood that had lost its structural integrity sometime during the previous administration. The room beyond was larger than expected, perhaps 6 meters by 4, with equipment racks lining the walls and a central workspace dominated by what appeared to be the building's network infrastructure hub. Except the infrastructure was all wrong. Where Kahl expected to see modern fiber optic routing equipment, network switches, and digital distribution systems, he found instead a museum piece that belonged in historical archives rather than functional building operations. A telephone switchboard, the kind that had been obsolete for over a century, with physical cables and mechanical switches and indicator lights that glowed with the warm amber of incandescent bulbs rather than the cool precision of LEDs. The board was massive, covering an entire wall, with rows upon rows of connection points, patch cables hanging in organized chaos, and switches labeled in fading marker. North Wing, rooms 101-115. South Wing, rooms 201-230. Kitchen, main, workshop, basement. Every door lock in the building, every access control point, every secured area wasn't controlled by electronic access systems with wireless keycards and biometric scanners. They were controlled by physical electrical switches on a 1940s-era telephone exchange panel. Kahl stared at the switchboard with the growing horror of someone whose entire tactical approach had just been rendered completely useless. His Omni key, the piece of equipment he'd managed to retain when abandoning his armor. was a masterwork of digital infiltration technology. Quantum processors running adaptive cracking algorithms, wireless protocol emulation for 300 different security standards, biometric spoofing, electromagnetic pulse generation for disabling electronic locks, 50,000 credits of bleeding-edge hacking equipment, designed to compromise any digital security system manufactured in the last century. Absolutely useless against a wall of mechanical switches and copper wiring. He approached the switchboard anyway, because desperation made people try impossible things. The OmniKey interfaced with modern systems via wireless protocols or physical data connections. The switchboard had neither, just electrical terminals, physical switches, and patch cables that probably predated his grandparents. There had to be a control system, something modern interfaced with the old infrastructure. A computer monitoring the switches, a digital overlay providing remote access, something he could hack. Kahl found it in a corner of the room, a terminal that looked almost contemporary, with a flat screen display and a data port that matched his OmniKey's physical interface spec. Hope flared. Modern infrastructure, digital systems, something he understood. He plugged the OmniKey into the terminal's data port and activated the intrusion suite. The OmniKey's screen lit up with scrolling code, quantum processors analyzing the target system's architecture, identifying vulnerabilities, preparing to inject the kind of sophisticated malware that could take over building management systems and grant him access to every door, every lock, every secured space. The analysis completed in 0.3 seconds. The OmniKey displayed its findings. No digital system detected. Physical switching only. Connection terminated. Because the terminal wasn't a computer. It was a monitoring station displaying the switchboard's physical state through simple electrical continuity testing. No processing, no software, no operating system to compromise. Just LEDs indicating whether switches were open or closed, powered by direct voltage from the circuits themselves. The OmniKey tried to interface anyway. Quantum processors attempting to find purchase in a system that operated on principles predating integrated circuits. It was like trying to hack a brick wall by explaining to it why it should open up and let you through. The device began heating up in Kahl's hand, processors running at maximum capacity while achieving exactly 0 results. Warning indicators appeared on the screen. Incompatible architecture, system mismatch, processing error. Then the smoke started. The OmniKey's quantum processors, designed for digital warfare, were trying to make sense of an electrical circuit that didn't have any intelligence to compromise. The feedback loop created by interfacing advanced computational systems with basic electrical switches was generating heat faster than the device's cooling system could dissipate. Kahl pulled the OmniKey free from the terminal, watching his 50,000 credit infiltration tool smolder in his hand, its screen showing a cascade of error messages before going dark entirely, fried, destroyed by attempting to hack something that had no concept of being hacked. Admiral Switchboard Sally Morrison sat in her residential unit on the 3rd floor, reading a mystery novel that had been written before the building's construction, enjoying the kind of quiet afternoon that retirement was supposed to provide. Her hearing aid, tuned to monitor the building's electrical grid in addition to its stated function of amplifying sound, picked up the characteristic signature of a device attempting to interface with the communications room terminal. Not the normal maintenance signature, but something foreign. Something that drew power in patterns she didn't recognize. She set down her novel and picked up her handset, an actual physical telephone connected to the switchboard, because wireless communications could be intercepted, and Sally had spent 40 years in military communication security, learning exactly how insecure most secure systems actually were. She plugged the handset into a jack labeled Workshop Direct. Admiral Holloway answered on the first ring. Workshop. Sally, someone's trying to access the communications room terminal. Foreign device, drawing unusual power from the monitoring circuit. Can you identify the source? East Wing Service Corridor. The terminal in Com Room Alpha. Recommendations? Sally considered the problem with the methodical approach of someone who debugged communication failures under enemy jamming for 4 decades. Someone was trying to compromise her switchboard. Someone had physically accessed a secured room and was attempting to manipulate systems they clearly didn't understand. In the military, This would have been classified as an intrusion attempt. Appropriate response: lockdown and investigation. In a retirement home where 6 former fleet admirals were currently entertaining themselves with an unwanted visitor, appropriate response was considerably more flexible. "Someone's trying to fish on the intranet," Sally said into the handset. "Send them the unsubscribe package." "Acknowledged," Holloway replied. "Give me 30 seconds." Sally hung up and walked to her personal electrical panel, a small breaker box she'd installed in her unit for managing her various electronic modifications. She flipped switch number 7, labeled in neat handwriting, "Comm Room Override." In the basement workshop, Admiral Holloway located the corresponding circuit on her master control panel. The communications room monitoring terminal ran on standard 120-volt building power. Normal, safe, designed for electronic equipment with proper grounding and surge protection. But the circuit could be modified. The voltage could be increased. And if someone had a device physically connected to that circuit, well, they were about to learn an important lesson about air gapping. Holloway pulled the power routing lever, redirecting the communications room circuit through a transformer normally used for welding equipment. Then she adjusted the voltage regulator to maximum. The terminal in the communications room, which had been drawing a polite 120 volts to power its indicator LEDs and monitoring circuits, suddenly received 480 volts of 3-phase power designed for industrial machinery. The surge traveled down the power line, through the monitoring terminal circuits, and into the data port where Kahl's OmniKey had been plugged in 0.5 seconds earlier. The OmniKey had thermal protection, surge protection, electromagnetic shielding, and fail-safes designed to prevent exactly this kind of electrical attack. They were rated for surges up to 1,000 volts and could handle electromagnetic pulses from close-range weapon detonations. They were not designed for 480 volts of 3-phase industrial power, being deliberately routed into what was supposed to be a low-voltage data connection. The device exploded. Not a gentle failure or a controlled shutdown, but an actual explosion as its internal power regulators failed catastrophically. The lithium battery caught fire, and several years of miniaturized quantum computing equipment converted themselves into shrapnel and smoke in under half a second. Kahl dropped the device with a yell that turned into a cough as smoke filled his damaged lungs. The OmniKey hit the floor and continued burning, acrid chemical smoke rising from its shattered casing. Display screen cracked and dark. 50,000 credits of technology reduced to an expensive paperweight that happened to be on fire. His wrist-mounted computer, which had been interfaced with the OmniKey for coordination and data sharing, sparked and went dark. Not an explosion, but the kind of quiet electronic death that suggested every integrated circuit had just experienced voltages well beyond their design specifications. The terminal's screen flickered once, indicator lights dimming briefly as the voltage surge passed through the system. Then everything returned to normal. LEDs glowing their steady amber, displaying the unchanging state of mechanical switches that didn't care about digital intrusions or counter-hacking or quantum processors. Kahl stood in the communications room, hand burned from holding a device that had turned itself into a thermal event, lungs full of toxic smoke from burning electronics, staring at a wall of 1940s technology that had just destroyed his infiltration equipment through the simple expedient of being exactly what it appeared to be: old, analog, and completely immune to modern compromise techniques. The building's intercom system clicked on. Admiral Sally Morrison's voice came through, carrying that same bureaucratic politeness that was somehow worse than direct threats. "Attention. Building management has detected an attempted unauthorized access of communication systems. The responsible party's subscription to building amenities has been terminated. Thank you for your cooperation." The intercom clicked off. Kahl looked at the smoldering remains of his OmniKey, at the dark screen of his wrist computer, at the switchboard that continued its patient operation exactly as it had for the last 80 years. No digital locks to hack, no wireless systems to compromise, no network to infiltrate, just copper wiring, mechanical switches, and electrical circuits that operated on principles that predated cybersecurity by about a century. Air gapping, taken to its logical extreme. If there was no digital system to attack, there was no digital vulnerability to exploit. And if someone tried to force the issue by physically connecting anyway, well, Industrial voltage made an excellent argument for why that was a bad idea. He'd lost his armor to magnets, his camouflage to acoustic interference, his health to industrial sterilization systems, and now his only remaining piece of sophisticated equipment to an electrical surge from a monitoring terminal. 4 rounds in his sidearm, a bodysuit, burns, chemical exposure, and lung damage that would require weeks of medical care. And somewhere in this building, 6 elderly humans who'd spent the morning systematically stripping him of every advantage he'd ever possessed. The door to the communications room remained locked. The switchboard hummed with its patient mechanical operation. And Kahl had absolutely no idea how to open a door controlled by physical switches when all his training had focused on electronic systems. He could shoot the lock. 4 rounds, 3 after that. Keep spending ammunition on problems that shouldn't require ammunition until he had none left, and the next problem would definitely require ammunition. Or he could accept what his tactical training had been trying to tell him for the last 3 hours. He was outmatched, outmaneuvered, and completely out of his depth. The window in the communications room, small and reinforced with wire mesh, looked out onto the garden. He could see the koi pond from here, the trees, the flowers. Chen was still out there, probably still pruning his bonsai with the serene focus of someone who'd eliminated all stress from his life except for the stress he deliberately chose to engage with. Kahl looked at the window, looked at the door, looked at the switchboard that had just fried 50,000 credits of equipment by being too old to hack. The window wasn't locked. It didn't need to be locked. It was 2nd floor, 12 feet up, reinforced glass, wire mesh. He shot it 3 times. The glass spider-webbed. The mesh held for a moment, then gave way. 1 round left. Kahl climbed through the window and dropped into the garden below, landing badly, rolling across grass that smelled of morning dew and automated maintenance systems. Behind him, in the communications room, the switchboard continued its operation, indicator lights glowing amber, switches maintaining their positions, the building's electrical heart beating with the steady rhythm of technology that would outlast anything modern simply by being too simple to break. And in her residential unit, Admiral Sally Morrison made a notation in her mystery novel's margin. Comm room window, replacement cost approx 400 credits, deduct from infiltration pool. Then she returned to her reading. The detective was just about to reveal who the murderer was, and Sally always enjoyed a good conclusion. Chapter 9. The Nap Time Protocol. Kahl had been in the garden for 20 minutes, hiding behind the same ornamental fountain that had provided cover from the groundskeeping drones, trying to formulate something resembling a plan. The tactical situation had degraded beyond any reasonable recovery threshold. 1 round remaining in his sidearm. No armor, no camouflage, no hacking tools, no communications equipment. Burns across his face and hands that would require medical attention measured in weeks, not days. Lung damage from ozone exposure that made every breath feel like drowning. Eye damage that turned his vision into a blur of tears and after images. And 6 elderly humans who'd spent the morning systematically destroying every advantage he'd ever possessed, treating his infiltration like Wednesday morning entertainment. The garden offered limited tactical value. Open sight lines favored defenders over infiltrators. The foliage provided concealment but not cover. Leaves and branches wouldn't stop bullets or directed energy weapons or whatever other improvised horrors the admirals had hidden behind their facade of geriatric harmlessness. But it was outside. Natural space. The building systems couldn't reach him here. HVAC weaponization required enclosed spaces. Magnetic traps needed metal infrastructure. The garden was neutral ground by simple virtue of being too organic to weaponize. Or so he hoped. Recent experience suggested that assumptions about what could and couldn't be weaponized were dangerously naive. Admiral Chen had finished his bonsai pruning and moved to a different section of the garden, where he was now deadheading roses with the focused attention of someone who took their hobby very seriously. He wore the same sun hat, the same gardening gloves, the same expression of absolute serenity. He still hadn't looked directly at Kahl, hadn't acknowledged the intruder crouched 15 meters away. Just continued his work with the patient dedication of someone who had all afternoon and nothing more pressing to attend to. The koi pond rippled occasionally as fish surfaced for air, creating concentric circles that expanded and faded. The fountain's spray caught sunlight, creating small rainbows in the mist. Somewhere nearby, birds were singing, because the garden's ecosystem apparently included normal wildlife alongside weaponized maintenance drones. Peaceful, almost idyllic. The kind of environment that made Kahl's tactical training scream that something was terribly wrong, because nothing about this situation should feel peaceful. He needed to move, needed to find an exit, needed to breach the perimeter, needed to get beyond the facility's walls and into territory where the Admiral's home field advantage couldn't reach. The fence would be a problem, still electrified, still outputting enough voltage to bypass his suit's shielding if he'd still had his suit. But he could improvise, could use his bodysuit as insulation, could climb carefully, could... The building's exterior speakers crackled to life with feedback whine, not the intercom system that had delivered previous announcements. This was the external public address network, speakers mounted on the building's exterior for emergency notifications and community announcements, louder than the internal system, designed to reach residents who might be in the garden or the parking areas. An automated voice, the kind of synthesized speech that had been state-of-the-art in approximately 2150, began its announcement with the bureaucratic precision of pre-recorded messaging systems. The time is now 2 p.m. Quiet time protocols are now in effect. All residents are reminded to return to their units for afternoon rest period. The garden and common areas will be secured for the next 2 hours. Thank you for your cooperation. The announcement repeated once, then the speakers went silent. Kahl looked at the building. Nothing happened. No visible change. No immediate threat. Just an automated reminder about scheduled rest periods, the kind of routine that retirement facilities had maintained since the concept of retirement facility had been invented. Admiral Chen gathered his pruning shears and deadheading tools, placing them carefully in a small basket. He removed his gardening gloves, folded them neatly, and placed them beside the tools. Then he picked up his sun hat, dusted it off, and began walking toward the building's entrance with the unhurried pace of someone following a familiar routine. He passed within 5 meters of Kahl's position, close enough that Kahl could see the age spots on his hands, the slight stoop in his posture, the careful way he placed each step as if confirming the ground was solid before committing his weight. Chen didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge him, just walked past, opened the garden access door, and disappeared into the building's interior. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Kahl waited. 30 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes. Nothing happened. He was alone in the garden, isolated, exposed, but also unsupervised, which represented the first tactical opportunity he'd had since the hearing aid incident 6 hours and a lifetime ago. The perimeter fence was 20 meters away, chain link topped with decorative scrollwork that would provide handholds for climbing. Electrified, but he could work around that. Could use his bodysuit as insulation, could move carefully, could. The shutters began closing. Heavy steel panels, the kind designed for hurricane protection or blast resistance, descended over every window with the mechanical precision of automated systems executing programmed commands. They moved slowly, deliberately, like guillotine blades lowering in ultra-slow motion. The sound was a deep mechanical grinding, metal sliding against metal in guide rails that probably required regular maintenance to prevent seizing. Chunk, 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 rhythmic and patient, the building sealing itself against the outside world with the same casual inevitability as a bank vault closing at end of business. Ground floor windows, second floor, third floor. Every opening covered by steel panels thick enough to stop small arms fire, secured by locking mechanisms that engaged with solid metallic clicks. The garden's ambient light changed as the building blocked reflected sunlight, shadows shifting as its mass became more opaque, less permeable. The psychological effect was immediate and visceral. The building wasn't just closing, it was becoming a fortress. Then the garden's perimeter lights, decorative fixtures that normally activated at dusk, engaged with a soft electric hum. Except it wasn't dusk. It was 2 p.m. Afternoon sunlight still filled the garden with natural illumination. The lights hummed for perhaps 5 seconds. Then they cut out entirely, plunging the garden into darkness that was absolute and unnatural. not the gradual dimming of sunset or the natural darkness of night. This was the artificial absence of light created by systems designed to eliminate illumination as completely as possible. Every exterior light, every window, every source of reflected or transmitted illumination from the building went dark simultaneously. The only light remaining was sunlight from above, and even that seemed diminished, as if the garden had been transported into a space where photons didn't quite reach with their normal intensity. Kahl's eyes adjusted slowly, pupils dilating to capture what little illumination remained. The garden resolved into shapes defined by shadow gradients rather than actual visibility. Trees became dark masses against slightly less dark sky. The fountain was a suggestion of water sounds without visual confirmation. He activated his night vision. The bodysuit he'd retained when abandoning his armor included basic low-light enhancement. Not military-grade thermal imaging or active infrared, but enough to amplify available light into useful visibility. The kind of technology that had made night operations feasible since the mid-2100s. The garden sprang into sharp monochrome relief. Trees, bushes, the fountain, the koi pond, all rendered in the characteristic green-tinted contrast of light amplification. Not daylight clarity, but clear enough to navigate, to move, to see threats before they reached him. Tactical advantage restored. The darkness that was supposed to blind him had become his ally. The admirals had sealed themselves inside their building, and he had the garden to himself with functional night vision and the freedom to approach the fence without observation. Small mercies. He'd take those where he could find them. Kahl moved toward the perimeter, keeping low, using the fountain for cover until he cleared its concealment radius. The fence was 15 meters ahead, chain link visible as a geometric pattern against the darker background of trees beyond the property line. He'd covered perhaps 5 meters when he heard the first click. Not mechanical, not electrical. Something smaller, more portable. The distinctive click-clack of metal striking metal in a pattern that suggested deliberate signal rather than accidental noise. Click-clack. It came from his left, somewhere near the building's entrance. Kahl froze, night vision painting the garden in green-tinted shadows, showing him nothing but landscaping and architecture. Click-clack. Closer now, and from a different direction. His right, near the ornamental grasses. Then a third source behind him. Click-clack. Kahl spun night vision tracking movement that his conscious mind hadn't yet registered. A shape near the koi pond, human-sized but moving with the careful deliberation of someone navigating familiar territory in darkness. Admiral Vance, no bathrobe now. Practical dark clothing that blended with the shadows, moving without hesitation despite the total absence of visible light. His cane tapped against the path with that same hollow rhythm, but now accompanied by the click-clack signal from something small held in his other hand. Click-clack, click-clack. More clicking from multiple directions. Kahl's night vision resolved additional shapes. Admiral Chen emerging from behind the rose bushes, moving with the same confident navigation. Admiral Holloway near the ornamental fountain, walking with the precision of someone who knew exactly where every obstacle was positioned. They were surrounding him, converging from multiple approach vectors with coordination that suggested either extensive planning or such perfect familiarity with the garden's layout that darkness was irrelevant, and they were all clicking. Small handheld devices producing that distinctive click-clack pattern, signaling to each other, maintaining awareness of relative positions through sound alone. Paratrooper clickers. Kahl's tactical education supplied the reference. Ancient signal devices from early airborne operations, used for covert communication when visual contact was impossible and radio silence was mandatory. Two pieces of metal that clicked together when compressed, creating a distinctive sound that couldn't be easily faked or confused with environmental noise. Obsolete technology, museum pieces, utterly effective in darkness because they operated on the same principle as every other system in this building. Pure mechanical simplicity that couldn't be jammed, hacked, or compromised by electronic warfare. The clicking intensified, creating a three-dimensional sound map around Kahl's position. Click-clack from ahead, click-clack from behind, click-clack-clack from the left in a pattern that might mean contact or advance or target located in whatever signal code the Admirals used. Kahl's night vision showed them clearly. 6 elderly figures moving through the garden with the coordinated precision of a tactical squad, using terrain features for cover, maintaining overlapping fields of awareness through sound signaling. They didn't need eyes. They'd lived here for 20 years. They knew every tree, every bush, every decorative stone. The garden wasn't an obstacle course requiring visual navigation. It was an extension of their residential space, as familiar as their own units, navigable by memory and sound and accumulated spatial awareness. And Kahl, with his perfect night vision, giving him false confidence in his ability to see, realized he'd walked into an environment where sight was irrelevant and the advantage belonged entirely to those who didn't rely on it. Admiral Vance's cane tapped closer. Click-clack. The sound echoed off the fountain's stonework, creating acoustic confusion that made triangulation difficult. Was he 5 meters away? 10? Close enough to strike? Click-clack-clack-clack. Rapid pattern from multiple sources converging on Kahl's position with the mechanical certainty of a closing trap. Kahl raised his sidearm, 1 round remaining, trying to track targets that moved through darkness like they owned it. Which they did. The garden was theirs. The building was theirs. The darkness was just another system they'd mastered while he was still trying to understand the rules. His finger tightened on the trigger, muscle memory taking over as tactical training demanded he engage targets before they engaged him. Shoot the closest threat. Eliminate the immediate danger. Survive the next 5 seconds and worry about the rest later. Admiral Chen's voice came from the darkness, calm and conversational, as if commenting on the weather rather than a tactical encirclement in total darkness. The clicking is from the war, airborne operations. We used them when radio silence was mandatory and hand signals were invisible. Click-clack. Closer. Always closer. Of course, Chen continued, still in that same conversational tone. We also use them to communicate with each other during after-hours card games. The night shift nurses couldn't hear them from the monitoring station. Click-clack-clack. Pattern from the left. Another from the right. They were coordinating through sound, maintaining perfect spatial awareness, while Kahl fumbled with night vision that showed him shapes without context. The garden is particularly pleasant at this hour. Vance's voice added from a different direction than his clicking. Displacement tactics. Voice from one position, signals from another, making himself harder to target. Quiet, peaceful, good for the roses. His cane tapped, thunk against stone. Click-clack from a position 3 meters to the left of where his voice had originated. Kahl spun, trying to track multiple targets, night vision painting green shapes that moved with synchronized purpose. 1 round, 6 targets. Mathematics that didn't work in his favor. The clicking surrounded him now, creating an acoustic cage that suggested he was at the center of a loose circle, 12 meters diameter, with 6 convergence points maintaining distance while closing slowly. They weren't rushing, weren't attacking, just walking, clicking, signaling to each other with the patient coordination of people executing a familiar drill. Wednesday night war games, routine entertainment, nothing special. Admiral O'Malley's voice came from behind him, carrying that same conversational pleasantness. Did you know that 𝐬𝐭∗ can hear quite well? The clicking disturbs them initially, but they adapt. Everything adapts, given time. Click-clack. The sound was everywhere now, creating overlapping patterns that made individual sources impossible to isolate, like insects, like the chittering of beetles or the clicking of locusts, multiplied and amplified until it became the only sound that mattered. Kahl fired. The muzzle flash destroyed his night vision. Green amplification bloom overloading into white blindness that left after-images burning across his retinas. The round went somewhere into the darkness, hitting nothing, wasted on panic and acoustic confusion. No round remaining. 0 ammunition. Nothing left but a sidearm that was now an expensive paperweight. The clicking stopped. Silence crashed down, broken only by Kahl's ragged breathing and the gentle splash of the fountain. His night vision slowly recovered from the muzzle flash, green resolution returning in stages, painting the garden in familiar monochrome. The admirals were gone. not hiding, gone. They'd moved during his flash blindness, repositioning to new locations with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this drill hundreds of times. Then Admiral Vance's voice came from directly behind him, close enough that Kahl could feel the displacement of air from his words. "You're standing in the petunias," Vance said quietly. "Holloway gets very particular about the petunias." Kahl spun, but there was nothing there. Just darkness and the fading echo of a voice that had been exactly where night vision said nothing existed. Click, clack, from everywhere, from nowhere. The sound resuming its patient pattern, neither faster nor slower than before. Just the steady rhythm of communication that didn't require him to understand it to be effective. Kahl stumbled backward, away from the last voice, away from the clicking, away from targets he couldn't see despite technology designed to let him see in darkness. His foot caught on something, a decorative border stone maybe, or a garden edging, and he fell, landing hard on grass that smelled of morning dew and automated maintenance. The clicking continued above him, patient, unhurried, 6 sources moving through the garden with perfect confidence, signaling to each other, maintaining coordination through technology that predated wireless communication by about a century, and Kahl, lying on the ground with his perfect night vision showing him nothing useful, realized that the admirals weren't hunting him, they were just walking, just doing their normal evening constitutional, following familiar paths, using familiar signals, completely unbothered by the presence of an armed intruder who'd exhausted his ammunition firing at shadows. The darkness wasn't a weapon, it was just their preferred environment for exercise. Quiet time wasn't an attack, it was just their schedule, and the clicking wasn't psychological warfare, it was just how they talked to each other when they didn't feel like using words. Admiral Holloway's voice carried across the garden, matter-of-fact and administrative. "Someone's in the petunias, I'll need to resod that section." "Added to the bill," Vance replied from a completely different location than his previous position. Click, clack. Agreement, acknowledgement, or possibly just someone noting the time. The mechanical grinding sound resumed, shutters rising, lights activating, the building unsealing itself as quiet time protocols completed their scheduled cycle. Sunlight returned to the garden in gradual stages as the building's mass became permeable again. The admirals walked back toward the building's entrance, clicking patterns fading to silence as they transitioned from darkness coordination to normal afternoon routine. They didn't look back at Kahl, didn't acknowledge him beyond the note about the petunias. Just 6 elderly people finishing their constitutional, discussing garden maintenance, moving with the unhurried pace of residents who had all evening and nowhere else to be. Kahl lay in the petunias, night vision still painting the world in green monochrome despite the return of natural light. No ammunition left, no equipment functional, no tactical options remaining beyond surrender or continued futile resistance. And somewhere in the building, Admiral Holloway made a notation on her tablet. Quiet time exercise, 14-14-15. Target response, panic fire. Ammunition status, depleted. Recommend transition to endgame protocols. The garden returned to its peaceful afternoon quiet. The koi resumed their patrol patterns around the pond. The birds continued singing because none of this had been dramatic enough to disturb their routine. Wednesday afternoons at Serene Vistas. Very regular, very predictable, very boring, except when they weren't. Chapter 10. Broken hip. The petunias were surprisingly comfortable. Kahl lay among them, breathing hard, staring at the afternoon sky through night vision that was now completely unnecessary because the sun was out and quiet time had ended and his tactical situation had somehow managed to degrade beyond catastrophic into territory that didn't have words yet. No ammunition, no equipment, no armor. Burns, chemical exposure, eye damage, lung damage, and 6 elderly humans who just walked circles around him in total darkness while having casual conversations about garden maintenance. He needed to move, needed to find something resembling tactical advantage, needed to stop lying in decorative flowers like someone who'd given up. But moving required energy, and energy required not feeling like his entire body had been processed through an industrial accident. The ozone damage made breathing feel like drowning. The UV burns made movement feel like being skinned, and the psychological defeat of firing his last round at nothing while surrounded by clicking sounds felt like something his tactical training had never prepared him for. Admiral Chen emerged from behind a decorative arbor, carrying a ceramic teacup and saucer. He moved toward a garden bench with the unhurried pace of someone following familiar afternoon routine, setting the tea service down with careful precision. The cup was old, delicate porcelain with hand-painted designs that suggested significant value and probable irreplaceability. The kind of ceramic work that survived because someone cared enough to maintain it properly. Chen sat on the bench, picked up the cup, took a sip. Steam rose from the liquid. He set it back down on the saucer with a soft clink of porcelain on porcelain. Kahl's hand moved across the grass, searching for something, anything. His fingers found a piece of decorative border stone, perhaps half a kilogram, rough edges. Not much, but more than nothing. He gripped the stone, muscles tensing. Destroy something they value. Affect the environment. Prove he could still take action even if the actions themselves were futile. He threw. The stone flew true, arcing toward the cup with trajectory that came from desperation and basic physics. Chen's eyes tracked the projectile with the calm assessment of someone who'd coordinated drone swarms across three-dimensional battle spaces. He didn't move the cup, didn't flinch, just watched as the stone passed perhaps 5 centimeters to the left of the target and continued its arc into the ornamental grasses beyond. Complete miss. Kahl's depth perception, degraded by eye damage and exhaustion, had failed to account for distance and angle. Chen picked up his cup, examined it for damage he knew wasn't there, and set it back down. His expression remained absolutely neutral. No anger, no relief, no emotion. Just clinical observation. He produced a small radio from his pocket. Garden to all stations. Status update. Attempted property damage. Ornamental sector. Target unsuccessful, but intent documented. The radio crackled with acknowledgement signals. The clicking resumed from multiple sources Kahl couldn't see. Not the patient coordination pattern from earlier. Something different. 3 short, 2 long, pause, repeat. Status change notification, probably. Parameter adjustment. Admiral Holloway emerged from the building's garden entrance. Admiral Morrison followed, then O'Malley, then Vance. All of them converging with coordinated efficiency, positioning themselves with overlapping fields of awareness. Not surrounding Kahl, just repositioning, adjusting formation based on updated information. Chen stood, picked up his teacup and saucer, and walked toward the building entrance. His movements were unhurried, the same deliberate pace he'd maintained all morning. He passed within 3 meters of Kahl's position without looking at him, just continued walking until he disappeared into the building. The other admirals remained in their new positions, not moving, not clicking. Just standing with patient stillness. Admiral Holloway pulled out her tablet, navigating to building management systems with practiced efficiency. She tapped several menu options, made selections that Kahl's distance prevented him from reading clearly. Admiral Morrison produced her handheld radio. Workshop to all stations. Confirm status change to Condition 2. The radio crackled responses from various building locations. Confirmed, Morrison said. Implement Condition 2 protocols. Authorization, Morrison 7 Delta. She clipped the radio back to her belt. Vance tapped his cane against the gravel. Once, twice. The other admirals responded with click acknowledgments. Then, without further communication, they began walking back toward the building. Not retreating, not responding emotionally, just completing their afternoon routine with the same unhurried efficiency they'd maintained for 20 years. Admiral O'Malley was the last to leave. He paused at the garden entrance, produced a pocket notebook, and made a notation. Property damage assessment, he said, apparently to himself. Petunias, Riasad required, Sector 4. Ornamental grasses, minimal impact from projectile. Border stone, displaced, return to position recommended. Tea service, intact, no damage. Administrative overhead, approximately 4 hours documentation and recalibration. Billable at standard contractor rates per building maintenance agreement section 12.7. He closed the notebook and entered the building. The garden door clicked shut. Kahl lay among the petunias alone, listening to afternoon sounds. The fountain, the birds, building systems. Nothing had changed visibly, but the clicking patterns had been different. The radio calls had mentioned Condition 2. O'Malley had referenced billable contractor rates instead of pension credit betting. The building's intercom clicked on. Admiral Holloway's voice maintaining bureaucratic pleasantness. Attention. Building maintenance will be conducting scheduled infrastructure testing for the next several hours. Residents are advised to remain in their units. All exterior access points will be secured per fire code compliance protocols. Thank you for your cooperation. The intercom clicked off. Kahl stood slowly and looked at the building. Every window shutter was closed. Every exterior door showed red indicator lights of electronic locks engaged. He was outside. The building was sealed, and infrastructure testing probably meant something considerably more specific than routine maintenance. The garden, which had felt like neutral ground moments before, suddenly felt considerably more like a kill box with excellent landscaping. Chapter 11. The War Chest. The building remained sealed for 45 minutes. Kahl spent that time exploring the garden's perimeter, testing the fence at various points, confirming what his tactical assessment already knew. The electrified chain link was still outputting enough voltage to bypass any insulation his bodysuit could provide. The decorative scrollwork at the top would provide handholds for climbing, but not if he was being electrocuted on the way up. The garden access doors were electronically locked, red indicator lights glowing with the steady certainty of systems that wouldn't be compromised by anything as simple as physical force or desperate improvisation. The windows remained shuttered, heavy steel panels that would require industrial cutting equipment to breach. He was trapped outside, in a garden, surrounded by flowers and ornamental landscaping and a koi pond that continued its peaceful existence completely unbothered by the tactical situation. It was, objectively, the safest place he'd been since infiltrating Serene Vistas 6 hours ago. No magnetic traps, no UV sterilization, no weaponized HVAC, just grass and trees and the distant hum of building systems that couldn't reach him here, which made it the perfect kill box. Because the Admirals knew he was here, knew he had nowhere to go, knew that eventually they'd open a door and whatever Condition 2 protocols entailed would involve dealing with the intruder who'd attempted property damage and exhausted his ammunition firing at shadows. Kahl sat on the decorative fountain's edge, conserving energy, watching the building for changes. The burns across his face and hands had stopped actively hurting and transitioned into the dull throb of damaged tissue trying to heal without medical intervention. His lungs still burned with each breath, ozone damage making even shallow breathing feel like drowning in slow motion. But he was alive, mobile, conscious, more than he'd expected after the HVAC incident. The building's exterior speakers crackled with feedback whine. No automated voice this time, just Admiral Holloway, speaking with that same bureaucratic pleasantness that had characterized every announcement so far. Attention! Infrastructure testing has been completed ahead of schedule. All building systems have been returned to normal operational parameters. Exterior access points will remain secured until residential units confirm occupant accountability. Thank you for your continued patience. The speaker clicked off. Kahl stared at the building. Nothing changed visibly. The shutters remained closed. The door locks continued showing red indicators. Ahead of schedule suggested efficiency. Residential units confirm occupant accountability, suggested they were checking that everyone was where they were supposed to be before unsealing the building. And Kahl, who was definitely not where he was supposed to be, waited. Inside the building, Admiral Vance walked down the second-floor corridor toward the central supply closet, moving with that same measured pace, cane tapping against hardwood flooring. The corridor was residential wing territory, doors leading to individual units, common areas, the kind of spaces designed for comfortable living rather than tactical operations. The supply closet door was unmarked except for a small plaque that read, "Linen storage, authorized staff only." The kind of sign that had stopped meaning anything around 2160 when building security became more about liability than actual access control. Vance stopped at the door, produced a small key card from his bathrobe pocket, and swiped it through the reader. The lock clicked. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, flipping the light switch as he crossed the threshold. The closet was perhaps 3 meters by 2, shelves lining both walls, stocked with exactly what the plaque suggested. Linens, towels, sheets, pillowcases, all organized by size and color, with the kind of institutional precision that suggested either very dedicated housekeeping staff or someone who cared deeply about inventory management. Admiral Chen was already inside, standing before the back wall, examining a junction box that controlled the closet's electrical systems. Holloway followed Vance through the door, tablet in hand, O'Malley and Morrison entering last. 6 people in a linen closet. Crowded, inefficient. The kind of situation that normal people would avoid. But the admirals weren't here for the linens. Vance approached a small keypad mounted beside the junction box, partially hidden behind a stack of washcloths, the kind of security panel that might control access to utility systems or maintenance areas. He punched in a code. 1234. The junction box hummed. The overhead light flickered once, and the back wall of the linen closet, which had appeared to be solid concrete block painted institutional beige, rotated on a central axis with the grinding sound of heavy machinery that hadn't been used in quite some time. The wall was thick, perhaps half a meter, designed to look like standard construction from the outside while actually being a blast door disguised as interior architecture. The rotation revealed a cavity behind the false wall, a space roughly 2 meters deep that should have been building infrastructure or dead space, but was instead something considerably more interesting. Storage racks, military-grade equipment mounting systems, and an inventory of hardware that would have made any arms dealer very interested and any building inspector immediately contact law enforcement. Kinetic harpoons, 6 of them, racked vertically along the left wall, not the kind used for maritime applications or construction work. These were ship-to-ship boarding weapons designed to punch through armor plating and create anchoring points for tactical insertion teams. Each one was approximately 2 meters long, constructed from materials that didn't corrode or degrade, equipped with targeting systems that were either disabled or hibernating. Seismic grenades occupied the lower shelves, secured in foam padding that suggested they required careful handling. 12 units, each one capable of creating localized earthquake effects through resonant frequency generation. Illegal in 17 star systems. Restricted to military demolition teams in the others. Definitely not authorized for civilian possession. A crate marked atmospheric incendiaries, handle with extreme caution, sat in the back corner, warning labels faded but still legible. And taking up most of the right wall's vertical space, secured to a custom mounting bracket that looked like it had been fabricated specifically for this storage cavity, was something that Admiral Holloway had apparently nicknamed Bessie. It was difficult to categorize. Too large to be a rifle, too compact to be a proper artillery piece. The barrel assembly suggested directed energy weapons, but the power coupling indicated kinetic projectile systems, possibly both. Definitely not something that had ever been approved for civilian markets or standard military issue. The metal was oxidized, showing rust patterns that suggested decades without maintenance. But the structural components looked solid, functional, the kind of equipment that had been built to last in an era when planned obsolescence wasn't yet standard engineering practice. Admiral Holloway stepped into the hidden armory, tablet forgotten, expression shifting from bureaucratic neutrality to something that might have been nostalgia if retired fleet officers were capable of sentiment about weapons platforms. "I haven't fired Bessie since the siege of Orion," she said, running one hand along the weapon's barrel assembly. "Hope the battery still holds a charge." "Last maintenance cycle was 2189, Chen replied, consulting something on a small handheld device that looked like it predated modern inventory systems. Capacitor banks showed 73% charge retention, within acceptable parameters for long-term storage. "The targeting system will need recalibration," Vance added, examining the weapon's scope assembly. "But the mechanical components should be functional." Admiral Morrison was already pulling equipment from the storage racks, checking serial numbers against a list she'd produced from her pocket. Kinetic harpoons, 6 units, all present and accounted for. Seismic grenades, 12 units, storage seals intact. Atmospheric incendiaries, 1 crate, contents unknown but presumably sufficient. Did we ever file the return paperwork for these? O'Malley asked, genuine curiosity in his tone. I believe the quartermaster's office sent a memo in 2195, Holloway replied. Something about equipment audit discrepancies. And we responded. Filed it under administrative oversight. 40 years ago. I don't think anyone's following up at this point. Statute of limitations on military equipment embezzlement is 25 years, O'Malley noted. So technically we're clear. Embezzlement is such an ugly word, Vance said. I prefer failure to process decommissioning documentation, which is still a felony. Only if someone files charges, and the quartermaster's office was dissolved in 2201. Chen was already running diagnostic checks on the kinetic harpoons, connecting a handheld testing unit to each weapon's power cell. Harpoon 1 through 4, full charge. Harpoon 5, 87%. Harpoon 6, offline, power cell degradation. Recommend we use 1 through 5 for active deployment. Deployment to where? Morrison asked. The garden is approximately 40 meters across. Harpoons have minimum effective range of 75 meters. We'd overshoot any target by 35 meters and embed projectiles in the perimeter fence. Then we use the seismic grenades. Seismic grenades have a blast radius of 20 meters. We're standing 15 meters from the garden's center point. Point taken. Atmospheric incendiaries? Absolutely not. The fire suppression system isn't rated for that kind of thermal load. Holloway disconnected Bessie from its mounting bracket with practiced efficiency, the weapon assembly lowering on a hydraulic system that suggested it was considerably heavier than it looked. We don't need the harpoons. Bessie has variable yield settings. Low setting for confined spaces. High setting for anything requiring serious discouragement. Bessie's power coupling hasn't been tested in 40 years, Chen pointed out. The diagnostics showed acceptable charge retention. Acceptable for storage, not necessarily acceptable for active discharge. There's one way to find out. Admiral Vance tapped his cane against the floor, the sound echoing in the small armory space. Before we commit to deploying 40-year-old prototypes that we legally shouldn't possess, perhaps we should consider our objective. The others paused in their equipment assessment. The target is in the garden, Vance continued. Unarmed, injured, no equipment remaining, no extraction options, no tactical advantage. He's contained. So we wait, O'Malley said. We wait, Vance confirmed. Let him exhaust himself attempting escape. Let the burns and chemical exposure continue degrading his physical capability. Then, when he's sufficiently weakened, we simply open the garden access and complete the documentation. Documentation, Holloway repeated, the word carrying weight that suggested it meant something more specific than simple paperwork. Condition 2 authorizes physical containment of security threats. The relevant forms are in the administrative office. Standard template, unauthorized entry, attempted property damage, justification for defensive response. And if he attempts to breach the building? Then we deploy Bessie, but preferably not before we've filled out the incident report. Insurance requires documentation of proportional response. The Admirals stood in their hidden armory, surrounded by illegal military hardware they'd forgotten to return 4 decades ago, discussing the bureaucratic requirements for using it. Admiral Morrison made a notation in her inventory list. Bessie, marked for potential deployment pending administrative approval. Kinetic harpoons, available but impractical for current engagement geometry. Seismic grenades, available but contraindicated due to structural damage concerns. Atmospheric incendiaries, definitely not approved. Agreed, Vance said. Holloway looked at Bessie with the flat assessment of someone reviewing unused equipment. The modifications remain untested pending approved field incident. 40 years in storage. Testing would require range clearance and safety protocols, Chen replied, which we currently have. Garden is contained. No civilian exposure. But paperwork takes priority. Always does. The wall rotated back into position with that same grinding sound, concealing the armory behind institutional beige paint and stacks of carefully organized linens. The Admirals filed out of the closet, leaving it exactly as they'd found it. A supply storage area filled with towels and sheets and absolutely nothing that would interest building inspectors or law enforcement. Admiral Vance locked the door, pocketed his key card, and walked back down the corridor toward the elevator. The others followed, discussing administrative forms and incident documentation and the proper procedure for justifying defensive weapons deployment in a residential facility. Their voices faded as they descended to the ground floor, leaving the second-floor corridor silent, except for the ambient building systems and the distant sound of water running through pipes. In the garden, Kahl sat on the fountain's edge, watching the building for signs of change, unaware that 6 floors above him, people who legally shouldn't possess military-grade weapons had just decided that patience and proper documentation were more important than immediate deployment. For now, the building remained sealed. Building remained. And somewhere in an administrative office, Admiral Vance was pulling the relevant forms from a filing cabinet, preparing to document exactly why Condition 2 protocols might require the use of equipment that technically didn't exist in any official inventory. Chapter 12. Orbital Mechanics. The building remained sealed for another hour. Kahl spent that time examining his remaining options, which had degraded from limited to theoretical over the course of 7 hours. The fence was still electrified. The doors were still locked. The garden was still a kill box with excellent landscaping and absolutely no tactical value beyond place where he would eventually die of exposure or building systems. His bodysuit included a small emergency communicator embedded in the collar, designed for situations where primary communications had been compromised. Short range only, encrypted, capable of reaching orbital assets within a 100-kilometer radius. He'd avoided using it earlier because communications could be intercepted, triangulated, used to track his position. But his position was no longer a secret, and extraction had become considerably more important than operational security. Kahl activated the communicator with a series of taps against the collar's control interface. The system hummed to life, cycling through startup diagnostics, searching for friendly signals in the orbital band. His ship was up there somewhere. A Wraith-class stealth corvette, 80 million credits of cutting-edge infiltration technology, currently holding station in low orbit with automated protocols monitoring for his extraction call. The kind of vessel that could drop into atmosphere, grab him from a hot zone, and be gone before local authorities registered the atmospheric disturbance. The communicator found the ship's beacon after perhaps 10 seconds. Signal strength was good. Encryption handshake completed successfully. Connection established. Kahl triggered the emergency extraction protocol, a pre-programmed sequence that would bring the ship down to his coordinates for immediate pickup. No verbal communication required. Just a data burst that told the ship's AI, mission compromised, extract asset, execute departure at maximum velocity. The ship acknowledged with a simple confirmation tone. Extraction sequence initiated. Estimated time to arrival, 4 minutes, 30 seconds. Kahl allowed himself a moment of relief. 4.5 minutes. Then he'd be off this planet, away from serene vistas, beyond the reach of elderly humans who'd spent the morning systematically destroying every advantage he'd ever possessed. The garden's fountain continued its peaceful operation. Water sprang from the decorative sculpture in gentle arcs that caught afternoon sunlight. The koi pond rippled as fish surfaced for air. Birds sang in the trees, completely unbothered by tactical situations or extraction protocols. 4 minutes, 30 seconds became 4 minutes, 3.5 minutes, 3 minutes. Admiral Sally Morrison sat in her residential unit on the 3rd floor, monitoring radio frequencies with equipment that had been state-of-the-art military communications gear in approximately 2150. The hardware was old enough to qualify for museum exhibits, but it worked. And more importantly, it operated on principles that made modern jamming countermeasures completely useless. She'd been tracking the intruder's communication signature since he'd entered the building 6 hours ago. Not actively intercepting, that would have required energy and effort. Just passive monitoring, letting her equipment listen to the electromagnetic spectrum and flag anything interesting. The emergency extraction call had been very interesting. She'd identified the ship's orbital position within 30 seconds of the initial handshake. Military-grade stealth corvette, probably Wraith-class based on the signal encryption patterns. Currently holding station at 78 kilometers altitude, maintaining geosynchronous position over the facility. The ship's AI was already executing descent protocols, She could track its progress through changes in signal strength and Doppler shift. Atmospheric entry in approximately 2 minutes. Ground level arrival in 4. Sally reached for her communications panel, an analog switchboard that connected to her extensive radio equipment through physical wiring rather than digital interfaces. She selected a frequency adjacent to the ship's command channel, adjusted her transmission power to match orbital reception parameters, and activated her microphone. Wraith-class vessel, this is Serene Vista's air traffic control. We have you on approach vector for emergency extraction. Please acknowledge. There was a pause. The ship's AI processing the unexpected communication, running authenticity checks, comparing the transmission against known air traffic control protocols. Sally had spent 40 years in military communications. She knew exactly what those authenticity checks were looking for, and she knew exactly how to provide it. The right terminology, the right cadence, the right background static that suggested ground-based transmission equipment operating within normal parameters. The ship's AI responded, Serene Vista's ATC, this is Wraith 79er acknowledging. Executing emergency extraction protocol per asset directive. Request landing clearance for coordinates transmitted. Wraith 79er, we show your transmitted coordinates as conflicting with municipal safety zones. Recommend vector adjustment to approved emergency landing area. Transmitting revised coordinates now. Sally's fingers moved across her equipment panel, generating a data packet that looked exactly like legitimate air traffic control telemetry. Altitude adjustments, approach vectors, ground coordinates that would bring the ship down in a safe landing zone. The coordinates she transmitted were approximately 20 meters from the ship's intended target. Not a large adjustment, just enough to account for the difference between garden center and decorative fountain. The ship's AI processed the new coordinates, ran authenticity checks on the ATC transmission, found nothing suspicious. The signal matched proper protocols, used correct encryption, originated from ground-based infrastructure within the facility's registered airspace. Serene Vista's ATC, Wraith 79er acknowledging coordinate adjustment. Revised approach vector locked. ETA 2 minutes, 15 seconds. Acknowledged, Wraith 79er. Be advised, wind conditions are within acceptable parameters. Cleared for emergency descent. Sally set down her microphone and made a notation on her tablet. Communications intervention, 1547. Orbital asset redirected via ATC impersonation. Impact zone adjusted to minimize facility damage. Fountain replacement cost to be deducted from contractor billing. Then she picked up her mystery novel and returned to the chapter she'd been reading. The detective was explaining the murder weapon, and Sally always appreciated a good technical explanation. In the garden, Kahl watched the sky, counting down the seconds until extraction. 2 minutes, 1.5, 1 minute. The ship should be visible soon. Breaking through cloud cover. Descending on repulsor fields that would scatter debris and disturb the koi pond, but would get him off this planet and away from this nightmare. 45 seconds. 30 seconds. He saw it. A dark shape against afternoon sky, descending rapidly. Atmospheric friction creating a faint glow around its hull despite the stealth coating. Beautiful. Professional. Exactly what 80 million credits of military engineering should look like. The ship's trajectory was perfect, heading directly for the garden center, where he stood waiting. Automated targeting systems would have locked onto his communicator's beacon, guidance computers calculating approach vectors to place the boarding ramp within meters of his position. 20 seconds, 15 seconds. The ship's velocity began increasing. Atmospheric descent protocols required deceleration at this altitude, repulsor fields engaging to slow the vessel's approach. But the ship wasn't slowing, it was accelerating. 10 seconds. Kahl's tactical training, operating on instinct and pattern recognition, suddenly understood what was about to happen. The coordinates were wrong. The ship wasn't targeting him. It was targeting a point approximately 20 meters behind his current position, where the decorative fountain was located. He ran. 5 seconds. The Wraith-class corvette hit the fountain at approximately Mach 1.2, traveling at velocities appropriate for atmospheric transit but absolutely inappropriate for ground-level arrival. 80 million credits of stealth technology, advanced materials science, and cutting-edge engineering. converted into kinetic energy and distributed across a decorative water feature that cost approximately 4,000 credits when installed in 2168. The sound was apocalyptic. Not an explosion. Kinetic impacts don't explode, they transfer momentum. The fountain simply ceased to exist, along with approximately 3 cubic meters of soil, decorative stonework, and the underlying plumbing infrastructure. The ship's hull, designed to withstand micrometeorite impacts and directed energy weapons, handled the collision with structural integrity mostly intact. The repulsor systems, which should have been engaged for deceleration, were offline because the ship's AI believed it was executing a normal landing protocol. The Corvette hit the ground, skidded across grass that tore away in long furrows, clipped the edge of the koi pond with enough force to scatter fish and water across a 10-meter radius, and came to rest against the garden's perimeter fence with a final crunch of expensive metal meeting electrified chain link. Sparks erupted as the fence's electrical system attempted to process the sudden introduction of several tons of conductive starship hull. Circuit breakers somewhere in the building's infrastructure blew with sharp pops, cutting power to that section of the perimeter. The ship's emergency lights flickered, went dark, flickered again. The boarding ramp, designed to deploy automatically upon landing, remained closed because the ship's AI was still trying to understand why its telemetry data had been completely wrong about ground elevation. Kahl lay flat on the grass 20 meters away, having thrown himself clear of the impact zone with perhaps 2 seconds to spare. His ears rang from the sonic shockwave. His vision swam with after-images of the Corvette's atmospheric entry glow. But he was alive, and his ship, while damaged, was theoretically still functional. If he could reach the boarding ramp, if he could manually override the AI's confusion, if he could get the repulsor systems online, he could still extract. The building's exterior speakers crackled to life. Admiral Morrison's voice came through, maintaining that same bureaucratic pleasantness that had characterized every announcement so far. Attention! An unauthorized aerial vehicle has experienced a navigation error and made unscheduled contact with garden infrastructure. Building maintenance will assess damage and file appropriate incident reports. Residents are reminded that unscheduled flight operations within municipal airspace require proper clearance from traffic control authorities. Thank you for your cooperation. The speaker clicked off. Kahl stared at the building, then at his ship, currently embedded in the garden's perimeter fence, sparking occasionally as electrical systems attempted to restore themselves. Then back at the building. Navigation error, traffic control authorities. Admiral Morrison hadn't jammed his communications. She'd answered them, pretended to be air traffic control, fed his ship false coordinates, crashed 80 million credits of military hardware into a decorative fountain using nothing more than radio equipment and 40 years of communications expertise. His extraction asset was destroyed. His only way off the planet was now a smoking wreck that would require weeks of repair work, assuming the structural damage wasn't catastrophic. And somewhere in the building, an elderly woman had returned to her mystery novel, apparently satisfied that the navigation error had been properly documented. The garden's irrigation system engaged, automated sprinklers activating to water the grass on their scheduled afternoon cycle. Water sprayed across Kahl's prone form, adding insult to the literal injury of having his escape vehicle crashed into the landscaping. Through the spray, he could see the building, still sealed, still showing red lock indicators on every door, still completely unbothered by the fact that a starship had just demolished one of its decorative features. Admiral Sally Morrison made another notation on her tablet. Aerial navigation incident resolved. Asset grounded. Extraction capability eliminated. Recommend proceeding to containment phase per Condition 2 protocols. Then she turned the page of her mystery novel. The detective had just revealed the killer's identity, and Sally always appreciated a satisfying conclusion. In the garden, Kahl stood slowly, water dripping from his bodysuit, staring at his ruined ship, accepting what his tactical training had been trying to tell him for the last 7 hours. He wasn't getting out of this, not by equipment, not by expertise, not by expensive technology or desperate improvisation. The admirals had systematically eliminated every advantage he'd ever possessed, using nothing more than building infrastructure, analog systems, and an apparently bottomless capacity for bureaucratic malice. and he was standing in their garden, soaking wet from automated sprinklers, watching his extraction ship spark and smoke against their perimeter fence, with absolutely no options remaining beyond surrender or continued futile resistance. The choice at this point was almost academic. Almost. Chapter 13, The Arthritis Cannon. The West Wing access door opened at 16 was precisely, not the garden access Kahl had been watching, not the main entrance he'd expected. The West Wing, ground floor, a service entrance that should have remained locked under Condition 2 protocols. But the red indicator light switched to green. The electronic lock disengaged with a soft click, and the door swung open on recently oiled hinges, revealing an empty corridor beyond. Kahl stared at the open door from his position near the crashed Corvette. Open access, interior space. Potential tactical advantage if he could reach the building's infrastructure, find alternate routes, create distance from the garden kill box. Or a trap. Obviously a trap. Everything in this building had been a trap for the last 7 hours. But staying in the garden meant waiting for whatever Condition 2 protocols entailed. And his tactical training, operating on desperation and basic survival instinct, suggested that movement was preferable to static exposure. He ran, not the controlled tactical approach he'd used during infiltration. Just running, bodysuit providing no enhancement, legs burning from exhaustion and injury, crossing the 30 meters from Corvette wreckage to West Wing entrance in perhaps 8 seconds. He hit the doorway at full speed, shouldered through, landed in the corridor beyond with momentum he couldn't quite control. The door closed behind him with a soft pneumatic hiss, electronic lock re-engaging immediately. The corridor stretched ahead, institutional beige walls, linoleum floor showing wear patterns from decades of foot traffic. Fluorescent lighting flickered with irregular rhythm. Doors on both sides leading to what might be storage rooms or maintenance areas or residential units. Empty, silent, no immediate threats visible. Kahl moved forward, staying close to the right wall, eyes tracking for movement or traps or whatever other improvised horrors the Admirals had prepared. 20 meters down the corridor. 30. The hallway terminated in a T-junction that would offer route options, tactical choices, somewhere to go that wasn't a sealed garden or a crashed extraction ship. He reached the junction and turned left, still moving fast, still operating on adrenaline rather than planning. Admiral Vance stood 15 meters down the West Wing hallway, blocking the corridor with his presence and a walker. Standard mobility aid, aluminum frame with rubber grips, tennis balls fitted onto the rear legs. Completely ordinary except for the fact that Admiral Vance was positioned in the center of the hallway, facing Kahl's direction, hands resting on the walker's handles with the relaxed confidence of someone who knew exactly where the target would emerge. Kahl's momentum carried him 3 more steps before his tactical training reasserted enough control to stop. 15 meters. Too far for unarmed close combat. Too close to retreat without being engaged. Vance's foot pressed against something on the walker's frame. A small button or trigger hidden beneath safety padding. The walker's rear leg shifted. Hydraulic systems engaged with a soft pneumatic hiss. Mechanisms deploying from within the apparently hollow frame. Stabilizing struts extended downward, drilling into the linoleum with grinding sounds that suggested serious engineering. 4 additional support points, each one locking into position with mechanical precision. The walker's weight distribution spreading across a footprint that anchored it to floor and substrate. The tennis balls fell away as the struts deployed, rolling across linoleum with soft bounces. Underneath where the tennis balls had been, cooling vents, small apertures designed for heat dissipation. The walker's front section rotated on a central axis. The handles shifted positions, becoming weapon controls, and from the walker's central body, previously concealed behind structural tubing, a barrel assembly extended. 6 rotating barrels in hexagonal configuration. Gatling design, updated with modern materials and mechanisms. The weapon locked into firing position with a solid mechanical chunk, its weight now distributed across the stabilizing struts anchored into the floor. Admiral Vance stood behind what had become a fully deployed weapons platform, hands on controls, expression neutral. "Bessie," he said simply. Mark 7 rotary cannon, prototype, 40-year-old design, still functional. The barrel cluster began spinning, slowly, then faster. The electric motor whined at frequencies that started low and climbed into ranges that suggested serious mechanical forces, not medical equipment, weapon systems. Kahl turned and ran back the way he'd come, desperate retreat toward the T-junction, toward anywhere that wasn't directly in front of 6 rotating barrels. The rotary cannon opened fire. The sound was apocalyptic. Each round kinetic, metal traveling at velocities that made armor irrelevant. 30 rounds in 2 seconds, discharged at rates that made individual shots indistinguishable from continuous roar. The hallway shredded, not metaphorically. The corridor's infrastructure simply disintegrated under sustained rotary cannon fire. The beige paint vaporized. The drywall beneath exploded into powder and fragments. The structural supports, wooden studs and metal bracing, splintered and bent and scattered as kinetic rounds passed through them like they weren't there. Ceiling tiles fell in cascading sections, suspended gridwork collapsing as support points ceased to exist. Fluorescent light fixtures exploded, showering glass and electronic components. The linoleum floor rippled as rounds impacted concrete substrate, cratering and fracturing. Kahl dove through the T-junction as the burst continued, throwing himself around the corner with perhaps half a second before the rotary cannon's tracking arc would have intersected his previous position. The wall behind where he'd been standing simply ceased to exist, replaced by ragged holes that showed the next corridor over. Daylight from windows. The building's internal architecture laid bare. The barrel cluster wound down, rotation slowing, electric motor descending through frequencies until it reached idle. Smoke drifted from cooling vents, thermal exhaust from sustained fire. 20 meters of West Wing hallway had been converted into architectural salvage and construction debris. The corridor looked like it had been processed through industrial demolition equipment. Walls showing skeletal framework, ceiling open to ductwork and wiring, floor cratered in patterns that suggested systematic destruction rather than random impacts. Vance's voice carried through the destroyed hallway, amplified slightly by the building's intercom system that someone had patched into the West Wing speakers. Accuracy acceptable. Dispersion pattern within predicted parameters. Recoil management via floor anchoring proves sufficient. Kahl pressed his back against the T-junction wall, breathing hard, listening to performance assessment delivered with the same clinical detachment as every other interaction. Not triumph, not excitement. Just procedural notation about weapon systems testing. You have options. Vance continued, voice coming from speakers rather than direct speech. Continue attempting tactical solutions. Force additional countermeasure deployment. Escalate until someone requires medical intervention and extensive documentation. The barrel cluster was still spinning at idle, audible through the destroyed corridor, ready to ramp back to full discharge if Vance decided another burst was warranted. Or accept that engagement parameters have shifted beyond recovery. Follow standard protocol for asset neutralization. Surrender to facility administration. We complete relevant documentation. You receive appropriate medical attention. Everyone proceeds to next phase with minimal complications. The rotary cannon's idle hum continued. Patient, mechanical. The sound of weapon systems maintaining operational readiness, while their operator discussed bureaucratic options. Kahl remained pressed against the wall, staring at 20 meters of shredded hallway, accepting what 7 hours of systematic equipment destruction had been building toward. No armor, no weapons, no extraction, no tactical options remaining beyond surrender or dying in a retirement home corridor that had been converted into a firing range. The building's intercom clicked on. Admiral Holloway's voice, maintaining that same bureaucratic pleasantness. Attention! Maintenance has detected structural damage in the West Wing. All residents are advised to avoid that corridor until repair assessment is completed. Building management apologizes for any inconvenience. The intercom clicked off. Kahl heard footsteps in the destroyed corridor. Not just Vance. Multiple sources. The other admirals converging on the West Wing, moving with coordinated efficiency toward the T-junction where he'd taken cover. The barrel cluster continued its idle spin, the cooling vents exhausted heat. And somewhere in the demolished hallway, Admiral Vance made a notation on something. Tablet, clipboard, handheld device. documenting the engagement with the same administrative precision he'd applied to every previous countermeasure. Target contained, West Wing Junction. Vance's voice came through the intercom. Recommend proceeding to containment phase per condition 2 protocols. 𝐬𝐭𝐨𝐫𝐞 performance satisfactory. Hallway repair estimated at 4,000 credits. Billable to contractor per incident documentation. The footsteps grew closer. The rotary cannon hummed at idle, and Kahl, pressed against a wall with nowhere left to run, waited for whatever containment phase meant. Chapter 14. Insurance Fraud. Kahl remained at the T-junction for approximately 3 minutes, listening to footsteps approaching through the demolished West Wing hallway, calculating options that didn't exist. The corridor he'd retreated into offered limited tactical value. Doors on both sides, probably locked. Dead end visible 30 meters ahead where the hallway terminated at what looked like a fire door. No windows. No alternate routes except back through the junction into 𝐬𝐵𝐶's firing arc. The footsteps stopped, close enough that Kahl could hear the distinct tap of Vance's walker against debris-covered floor, the settling crunch of boots on shattered drywall and ceiling tiles. Admiral Holloway's voice came through the building's intercom system, addressing someone who wasn't Kahl. Workshop to West Wing position. Confirming target location. T-junction, secondary corridor, Vance replied, his voice now coming through speakers rather than direct speech. Contained. No egress routes visible from current vantage. Hold position. Assessing structural options. The intercom clicked off. Kahl pressed against the wall, trying to understand what structural options meant in the context of a building that had already weaponized every system he'd encountered. HVAC, magnets, gardens, communications, mobility aids. What structural elements remained that hadn't been modified to kill him? The answer, apparently, was the structure itself. In her basement workshop, Admiral Holloway stood before a large blueprint spread across her workbench. Architectural drawings that showed the building's original construction specifications from 2142. The paper was yellowed, creased from decades of storage, annotated with handwritten notes and modifications that documented 80 years of repairs, renovations, and upgrades. The West Wing was outlined in faded blue ink, a rectangular addition to the main building that had been constructed in 2156 to accommodate expanded residential capacity. 3 floors, 42 units, built during an era when construction standards were more about speed than structural redundancy. Admiral Chen stood beside her, examining the blueprints with the focused attention of someone reviewing tactical maps. West Wing structural assessment. What are we looking at? Holloway's finger traced support columns on the blueprint, counting load-bearing elements, checking stress distribution calculations that had been penciled into the margins during some previous review. Pillar 4 was flagged during the 2189 inspection. Concrete degradation, insufficient rebar density. Recommended reinforcement never completed. Follow-up inspection scheduled for 2195 was canceled due to budget constraints. Current load capacity? Within acceptable parameters for normal residential use, not within acceptable parameters for sustained stress or localized failure scenarios. Chen studied the blueprint, following the load distribution lines that showed how weight transferred through the building's framework. If Pillar 4 fails, cascade effect. Pillars 5 and 6 would compensate temporarily, but they're carrying loads beyond original design specifications. Estimated time to secondary failure, 45 to 60 seconds. Tertiary collapse follows naturally once the load-bearing triangle is compromised. Controlled or uncontrolled. Controllable if we sequence the failures appropriately. Remove Pillar 4, allow propagation to 5 and 6. Wait for structural settling. The West Wing collapses inward along the architectural seam where it joins the main building. Clean separation, minimal impact on primary structure. Collateral damage? West Wing total loss. Estimated 42 residential units rendered uninhabitable. Building value reduction approximately 8 million credits. Insurance coverage sufficient if we document properly. Chen made a notation on his handheld device. Residents? West Wing was emptied per Condition 2 protocols. All residents relocated to East Wing temporary housing. 0 civilian exposure. Target location relative to collapse zone. Holloway's finger moved across the blueprint, tracing the corridor where Kahl had taken refuge. T-junction, secondary corridor. That section remains structurally sound during initial collapse. Load redistribution funnels him toward the bingo hall. Only corridor that maintains integrity throughout the demolition sequence. Exit options from bingo hall? 2 doors. North exit leads to main building, controllable via standard locking protocols. South exit leads to parking area, electronic seal already engaged. Both routes monitored. Chen considered this for perhaps 10 seconds, running probability calculations, assessing complications. Recommendation: proceed with structural demolition. File insurance claim citing termite damage and deferred maintenance. Building inspectors haven't visited since 2189. Documentation supports negligence narrative. Claim processes in 6 to 8 weeks. Rebuilding begins after incident resolution. Seconded, Chen replied. Holloway picked up her radio. Workshop to all stations, implementing structural containment protocol. West Wing will experience controlled demolition in approximately 2 minutes. All personnel maintain safe distance from collapse zone. Condition 2 remains active. The radio crackled acknowledgments from various positions around the building. Holloway navigated to a different section of her workshop, where equipment that looked considerably less like hobby projects and more like industrial demolition tools occupied a dedicated storage area. Small shaped charges, detonation cord, wireless triggering systems that had probably been military surplus at some point before being repurposed for building maintenance. She selected 3 charges, checked their readiness indicators, and placed them in a canvas bag that was labeled, somewhat optimistically, plumbing repair kit. Pillar 4 requires 3 placement points, she said, more to herself than to Chen. Base, mid-column, and stress joint. Sequential detonation with 0.2 second intervals. Should provide clean failure without excessive fragmentation. Chen was already pulling up building evacuation status on his tablet. Final check. West wing clear, east wing secured, garden perimeter established, target contained in secondary corridor. All parameters satisfied for structural intervention. Holloway slung the canvas bag over her shoulder and walked toward the workshop exit. Let's remodel. In the west wing secondary corridor, Kahl heard sounds that didn't match normal building operations. Scraping, metal against concrete, the distinctive sound of equipment being positioned, adjusted, secured to surfaces. Then silence. The building's intercom clicked on, Admiral Morrison's voice maintaining that same bureaucratic pleasantness. Attention. Building maintenance will be conducting structural assessment in the West Wing over the next several minutes. Residents are advised that loud noises may occur. Please remain in your current locations until maintenance completes scheduled work. Thank you for your cooperation. The intercom clicked off. Loud noises, structural assessment, scheduled work. Kahl's tactical training supplied a translation. They were about to bring down part of the building, with him inside it. The first detonation was small, muffled by concrete and structural materials, more of a deep thump than an explosion. But the effect was immediate and catastrophic. The floor shifted beneath Kahl's feet. Not dramatically, just a subtle tilt, perhaps 2 degrees, the kind of slope that suggested weight distribution had changed somewhere in the building's framework. Ceiling tiles rattled in their suspended grid. Dust drifted down from gaps where walls met ceiling. The second detonation, 0.2 seconds later, was louder. Close enough now that Kahl could feel the vibration through the floor, the concussive force transmitted through concrete and steel and the building's skeletal architecture. The corridor's tilt increased. 3 degrees, 4 degrees. The walls began making sounds walls shouldn't make. Creaking, groaning, the structural equivalent of metal under stress. Cracks appeared in the drywall, spreading from corners where stress concentrated, visible lines that propagated like lightning across painted surfaces. The third detonation was directly beneath him, close enough that Kahl felt it through his boots, the floor's concrete substrate transmitting the shock wave with perfect efficiency. The west wing began to collapse, not explosively, not the chaotic destruction of uncontrolled demolition. This was engineered failure, propagating along predetermined stress lines, following the building's natural weaknesses with the precision of someone who understood exactly how architectural frameworks distributed weight. Pillar 4 failed first, concrete crumbling as load-bearing capacity dropped to zero. The weight it had been supporting, 3 floors of residential units, corridor infrastructure, roof assembly, transferred immediately to pillars 5 and 6, which were, as Holloway had noted, already carrying loads beyond original design specifications. They held for 47 seconds, long enough for Kahl to start running toward the far end of the corridor, away from the T-junction, toward the fire door that represented the only egress option. Long enough for him to cover perhaps 20 meters before the secondary failure cascade began. Pillar 5 failed with a sound like artillery, concrete fracturing under stresses it had never been designed to handle. The building's east-facing wall started folding inward, 3 floors of residential architecture collapsing along the vertical seam where the west wing joined the main structure. Pillar 6 followed 6 seconds later, unable to compensate for loads that had just doubled. The entire west wing's structural framework, deprived of its load-bearing triangle, simply gave up and fell inward with the grinding roar of several thousand tons of building materials obeying gravity. The corridor Kahl was running through didn't collapse. Holloway's calculations had been precise. The secondary corridor's support structure, independent of the main west wing framework, maintained integrity even as everything around it crumbled and fell. But it became a tunnel. Walls on both sides disappeared, replaced by open space where residential units had been. The ceiling above him was now the only ceiling remaining in this section of the building, a concrete slab suspended over empty space by supports that were suddenly doing considerably more work than they'd originally been designed for. Dust filled everything. Visibility dropped to meters, then to less than meters. The sound was overwhelming. Concrete breaking, metal bending, materials cascading down 3 floors worth of vertical distance to impact ground level, with successive crashes that made hearing impossible. Kahl kept running, guided more by momentum than vision, heading toward where the fire door should be, where egress should exist, where any escape route better than buried in building collapse might be available. He hit the fire door at full speed, shoulder slamming into steel that didn't budge. Locked. Electronic lock showing a red indicator through the dust. Sealed per Condition 2 protocols, completely unbothered by the fact that the building around it had just experienced controlled demolition. The corridor stretched behind him, the only structure remaining in what had been the west wing. Everything else, residential units, hallways, the west-facing exterior wall, was gone. Just rubble, settling into piles, dust creating a haze that made assessment impossible. And ahead, visible through the clearing dust at the corridor's far end where it joined the main building, was a doorway marked with faded paint. Recreational facility, bingo hall. The only door remaining, the only route available, the only space the collapse had been specifically designed to leave intact. Kahl walked toward it, legs unsteady from adrenaline and physical exhaustion, breathing dust-laden air that his damaged lungs processed with difficulty. The doorway wasn't locked, didn't need to be locked. It was the only option remaining, which made locks redundant. He pushed it open and stepped into the bingo hall. The room was approximately 15 meters by 12, with a low ceiling showing acoustic tiles and fluorescent lighting that flickered irregularly. Folding tables were set up in rows, chairs arranged with institutional precision. A bingo cage sat on a table at the far end, the kind that tumbled numbered balls through clear plastic, completely manual, completely analog. 6 people sat at a long table along the north wall, not at the folding tables, not arranged for playing, just sitting in a line, hands folded, expressions neutral, watching the doorway where Kahl had just entered. Admirals Vance, Holloway, Chen, Morrison, O'Malley, and the 6th, whose name Kahl had never learned, but who was undoubtedly also a former fleet admiral, based on the coordinated patience they all displayed. The table had a single empty chair positioned in the center of the room, facing the line of admirals, waiting, obviously waiting, for him. The building settled around them, rubble compacting, dust drifting through air vents, structural stresses equalizing after the controlled demolition of an entire residential wing. Outside, through the bingo hall's small windows, afternoon sunlight continued its normal progression toward evening. Admiral Vance gestured to the empty chair with one hand, a casual motion that suggested invitation rather than command. "Please," he said quietly. "Sit." We're just about to call the final number. The bingo cage spun slowly, numbered balls tumbling through clear plastic with soft clicking sounds that echoed in the silent room. And Kahl, who'd spent 7 hours being systematically stripped of every advantage he'd ever possessed, faced 6 people who'd just collapsed part of their own building to funnel him into this specific room, at this specific time, for this specific conversation. He sat. The bingo cage continued spinning. The admirals watched with patient attention, and somewhere in the rubble outside, Admiral Holloway's structural calculations settled into their final configuration, exactly as designed. Chapter 15. The Board Meeting. Kahl stumbled through the doorway into the bingo hall, dust from the West Wing collapse still clinging to his bodysuit, lungs processing air that felt like broken glass with each breath. The room was quiet, not the quiet of empty spaces, but the weighted silence of occupied ones where nobody felt compelled to speak. 6 people sat at a long table along the north wall, not at the folding tables arranged in rows throughout the room, not positioned for playing, just sitting in a line, hands folded, watching the doorway where Kahl had just entered. Admirals Vance, Holloway, Chen, Morrison, O'Malley, and the 6th, whose name Kahl had never learned, all present, all waiting, all looking at him with the clinical assessment of people evaluating completed work. A single empty chair sat in the center of the room, positioned to face the table, waiting. At the far end of the hall, on a smaller table, a bingo cage spun slowly. The kind that tumbled numbered balls through clear plastic, completely mechanical, operated by a small electric motor that hummed at frequencies just on the edge of audible. The balls clicked softly against each other in the cage's interior, creating rhythm that filled the silence. Click, click, click. Kahl stood in the doorway, breathing hard, staring at 6 people who'd just collapsed part of their own building to funnel him into this specific room at this specific time. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Just 6 sets of eyes tracking him with the patient attention of people who had nowhere else to be. His tactical training tried to assess the situation. 2 doors showing red lock indicators. Windows too small for passage. No cover, no weapons. No options beyond standing here or moving forward. But assessment required options to evaluate, and the only option visible was the empty chair. Kahl's hand moved toward his sidearm, muscle memory operating despite complete absence of utility. The weapon was empty. Had been empty since Chapter 9. But desperation made people reach for familiar objects even when those objects provided nothing. 6 people watched this gesture with the same neutral expression. Not threatening, not mocking, just observing. The bingo cage continued its mechanical tumble. Click, click, click. Kahl's legs felt unsteady. The UV burns across his face and hands throbbed with each heartbeat. The ozone damage made breathing feel like drowning in slow motion. The exhaustion from 7 hours of systematic destruction pressed down with physical weight that had nothing to do with gravity. He'd been stripped of everything. Armor abandoned in a maintenance corridor. Camouflage crashed by acoustic interference. Hacking tools destroyed by voltage surge. Ammunition expended firing at shadows. Communications hijacked by false air traffic control. Extraction asset crashed into a fountain. Freedom of movement eliminated by building collapse. And now 6 people were sitting at a table in a bingo hall, saying nothing, just watching him stand in a doorway while a mechanical cage spun numbered balls with patient inevitability. The silence stretched. 10 seconds, 20, 30. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Just the bingo cage's click, click, click and the ambient sounds of a building that had just experienced controlled demolition settling into its new configuration. Kahl tried to formulate words. Threats, maybe. Demands. Questions about what happened next. But his tactical training had no protocols for situations where the opposition had already won and was simply waiting for acknowledgement of that fact. 40 seconds. 50. The weight of 6 people sitting in silent judgment was heavier than any weapon they'd deployed. Heavier than magnetic traps or UV sterilization or rotary cannons. Just accumulated presence. 600 combined years of military experience compressed into the act of sitting quietly and watching. 1 minute, Admiral Vance sat at the center of the line, hands folded on the table. Expression absolutely neutral. Not triumph, not anger, not satisfaction. Just clinical observation of someone standing in a doorway, processing defeat. The bingo cage spun. The balls tumbled. Click, click, click. Kahl's legs moved before his conscious mind authorized the action. 3 steps forward, 5, 10. Moving toward the empty chair because standing in the doorway required acknowledging that he was standing in a doorway, trapped, with nowhere else to go. Movement felt like choice. Movement felt like agency. Even if the only available movement was toward the one chair in the one room they'd specifically funneled him into. He reached the chair. Stopped. Looked at 6 people who hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't done anything except sit and watch. The silence was crushing, physical weight that made breathing difficult beyond the chemical damage already present. The accumulated mass of 600 years of warfare just sitting there, waiting. Kahl's tactical training finally gave up trying to find solutions. There were no solutions. There was just this chair and these 6 people, and the overwhelming realization that everything he'd experienced over the last 7 hours had been building toward this specific moment in this specific room. He wasn't standing here because he'd fought his way through. He was standing here because they'd wanted him here. Every trap, every countermeasure, every systematic destruction of his advantages had been funneling him toward this chair. The bingo cage continued spinning. Admiral Vance's hand moved for the first time since Kahl had entered. Not a threatening gesture, not aggressive, just pointing at the empty chair with the casual efficiency of someone indicating an obvious next step. "Sit," he said quietly. 2 syllables, delivered with the same clinical detachment as every other interaction. Not a request, not a command, just acknowledgement that standing there processing defeat was taking longer than necessary. Kahl sat. The chair was uncomfortable. Standard folding construction, metal frame with thin padding, the kind found in every recreational facility and meeting space across known space. It creaked slightly under his weight. 6 people looked at him with the patient attention of individuals who'd just won a game he hadn't realized he was playing. The bingo cage continued spinning. Chapter 16, Unconditional Surrender. The bingo cage continued spinning. Kahl sat in the uncomfortable chair, facing 6 people who'd already won, breathing air that hurt his damaged lungs, calculating options that didn't exist. His bodysuit had one remaining function: emergency self-destruct. Small shaped charge embedded in the collar, designed for situations where capture meant interrogation, torture, intelligence compromise. The kind of last resort that professionals carried but hoped never to use. Honorable exit, quick, final. Better than whatever administrative processing these 6 people had planned. His hand moved to the collar's control interface, fingers finding the recessed activation panel through muscle memory. 3-press sequence, safety release, arming confirm, execute. Simple mechanical switches, no wireless components, impossible to jam electronically. He pressed the first switch. Click. Admiral Holloway pulled a small radio from her pocket, not the vintage military equipment she'd used earlier. Just a basic 2-way communicator, the kind building maintenance staff used for coordinating routine work. She pressed the transmit button. Workshop to break room. Activate Unit 7. Defrost cycle. Maximum duration. Static crackled. A voice responded. Acknowledged. Unit 7 active. Kahl pressed the second switch. Click. Somewhere in the building's break room, a microwave activated. Not for cooking, just running. The magnetron inside generating electromagnetic radiation at 2.45 gigahertz, the frequency specifically chosen for heating water molecules in food. Also, coincidentally, the exact frequency band that the bodysuit's self-destruct trigger mechanism used for its internal timing circuits. Kahl pressed the third switch. Click. Nothing happened. The shaped charge in his collar, which should have detonated with enough force to ensure quick death, remained inert. The bodysuit's trigger circuit was receiving the arming signal but couldn't complete the detonation sequence because a break room microwave was flooding its frequency band with radiation designed for reheating leftovers. The radio in Holloway's hand crackled. Unit 7 running. Estimated cycle time, 45 minutes. She set the radio on the table and returned her attention to Kahl with the same clinical assessment. Admiral O'Malley stood from his position at the end of the table. Not quickly, not with urgency. Just the careful rising motion of someone whose knees required negotiation with gravity. He reached under the table and retrieved a canvas bag. He walked toward Kahl with measured steps, carrying the bag in one hand, moving with the unhurried efficiency of someone executing a familiar task. Kahl tried to stand, to move, to do anything that suggested he retained agency. His legs were unsteady. The UV burns and chemical exposure and exhaustion made coordination difficult. He managed to get halfway out of the chair before O'Malley reached him. O'Malley's hand pressed against Kahl's shoulder. Not hard, not aggressive. Just enough pressure to suggest sitting back down would be more comfortable than resisting. Kahl sat. O'Malley opened the canvas bag and pulled out yarn. Purple yarn. Ugly, aggressively purple. The kind that suggested someone's well-meaning relative had purchased it on sale without consulting anyone about color preferences. He began wrapping the yarn around Kahl's wrists. Not roughly, not with force. Just the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent decades mastering rope work, knot theory, and the practical application of binding techniques to unwilling subjects. The yarn looked absurd, felt absurd. But when Kahl tried pulling his wrists apart, it held firm with tensile strength that suggested military-grade materials hiding under commercial disguise. O'Malley continued wrapping, creating loops and securing points with the methodical attention of someone following a specific pattern. Wrists secured, then ankles, then connecting lines between wrists and ankles, creating a hogtie configuration that prevented movement while maintaining circulation. Kahl tried to struggle to disrupt the process. The yarn absorbed the force, held firm, tightened slightly in response to the stress. Leverage mechanics. Self-reinforcing tension distribution. O'Malley adjusted a connection point, used a knitting needle from his pocket to tighten a loop that had slightly too much slack, and stepped back to examine his work with the critical assessment of someone checking for missed details. Kahl found himself effectively bundled, arms behind his back, legs bent, purple yarn covering most of his torso in a pattern that looked like someone's craft project had gone catastrophically wrong. O'Malley made a notation in his pocket notebook. Subject restrained 1704, materials, carbon weave yarn, pattern, double Windsor boa constrictor, effective immobilization achieved. He closed the notebook and looked at Kahl wrapped in purple yarn on the floor. Cozy, isn't it? He said. Chapter 17. Post-op review. The communications array was on the 3rd floor, in a room that the building directory listed as Resident Services, Video Conferencing. Admiral O'Malley dragged Kahl there, not roughly, just the efficient transport of someone moving an awkward package that happened to be wrapped in purple yarn and making occasional sounds of discomfort. The yarn's self-tightening properties made lifting easier. Tension distributed across multiple connection points, creating a harness effect that simplified the logistics of moving a bound adult male up 2 flights of stairs. O'Malley set him down against the wall near the conference table, adjusted the yarn slightly to ensure proper circulation, made a notation in his pocket notebook regarding transport completion time, 1742. The communications array occupied most of the room's far wall. Equipment that looked like it had been assembled from 3 different decades of technology, cobbled together with adapters and converters and the kind of technical improvisation that suggested someone understood signal processing at a fundamental level. Admiral Morrison activated the system with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent 40 years managing military communications infrastructure. Physical dials, analog switches, hardware routing that predated wireless by several generations. The main display screen showed the interior of what appeared to be a council chamber. Ornate architecture, high ceilings, 12 figures occupying elevated seats arranged in a semicircle. The High Council of Xylos. One of them leaned forward. Asset Liquidator Vaxen Kal. Report mission status. Silence. The council member's posture shifted. Kahl, confirm reception. Report status immediately. Admiral Vance walked into the camera's field of view, holding a teacup. Steam rose from the liquid. He settled into the chair facing the display screen with the careful attention of someone whose knees required negotiation. Set the teacup on the table within easy reach. Behind him, visible in the camera frame, the other 5 admirals sat at the conference table, also holding teacups, also apparently engaged in mid-afternoon tea service. And against the wall, barely visible at the frame's edge, a purple bundle that occasionally moved slightly. "Good evening," Vance said. "This is Admiral Edward Vance, resident of Serene Vista's retirement facility. I'm calling regarding your service request." The council chamber went absolutely silent. Vance picked up his teacup, took a slow sip, and set it back down. Then he reached for a sheet of paper on the table. Physical paper, printed text. The kind of documentation that suggested someone had taken time to format things properly. "Your contractor arrived at our facility this morning with apparent intent to terminate 6 residents," Vance said, holding the paper at reading distance. "He was unsuccessful. We've prepared an itemized assessment of associated costs and damages." He adjusted his reading glasses and began reading from the paper. "Item 1. Unauthorized entry and trespassing on sovereign diplomatic territory. Under the 2167 Treaty of Cascadia, this facility is registered as extraterritorial space. Security protocol review, legal consultation, and diplomatic filing costs, 40,000 credits. Vance looked up from the paper briefly, took another sip of tea, and continued. Item 2. Property damage. West Wing structural collapse requiring complete reconstruction of 42 residential units. Fountain replacement following orbital vehicle impact. Garden restoration including petunias, ornamental grasses, and koi pond stress mitigation. Corridor repair for plasma scoring and kinetic weapon damage. Fence reconstruction. Itemized total, 8,200,000 credits. One of the council members made a sound that the translation system struggled to process. Vance turned the paper over, examining the reverse side with the same careful attention. Item 3. Equipment confiscation. 1 Wraith-class stealth corvette, salvage rights claimed under diplomatic authority. Current estimated value, 12 million credits. Less disposal fees and processing costs. Net asset acquisition, 11,400,000 credits. He paused to drink more tea. The council chamber remained silent. Item 4. Administrative overhead. Incident documentation requiring approximately 80 hours of professional time across 6 personnel. Insurance filing preparation, law enforcement coordination, medical assessment scheduling, legal consultation fees, standard diplomatic contractor rates apply. Total, 240,000 credits. Vance set down his teacup and held the paper closer to the camera, displaying the text with enough clarity that the council could verify the itemization if they wanted. Item 5. Lawn care. Your contractor caused significant damage to landscaping maintained to diplomatic facility standards. Replacement costs, specialist consultation, emergency irrigation system repairs, 42,000 credits. He lowered the paper and looked directly at the camera. Total assessed liability, 31,922,000 credits. We accept wire transfers to the facility operating account. Alternatively, we'll negotiate planetary mining rights through standard diplomatic channels. Your choice. The council members began vocalizing simultaneously, overlapping sounds that the translation system couldn't resolve into coherent language. Vance waited patiently, sipping his tea, until they finished. You have 24 hours to arrange payment, he continued, still in that same conversational tone. After that, we calculate interest. Standard diplomatic rate, compounding daily. The interest rate is, he paused briefly, orbital. One of the council members finally produced coherent speech. This is extortion. We'll file formal complaints with every... Your contractor? Vance interrupted gently. Attempted to terminate residents of a facility registered as sovereign diplomatic territory. That makes his actions an act of war under interstellar law. We've already filed complaints with 17 regulatory bodies. The legal framework is well established. You contracted for an assassination. It failed. Now you're liable for damages. He took another sip of tea. However, Vance continued, setting down the cup with careful precision, if you'd prefer to contest this through extended legal proceedings rather than simply paying the assessed amount, we can accommodate that. It would require us to come out of retirement to provide testimony, coordinate with authorities, participate in hearings. We've been retired for quite some time. Coming out of retirement would be... He paused again. Inconvenient. The way he said inconvenient suggested that inconvenience would be distributed to multiple parties, not just the admirals. The council chamber went silent again. Not confused silence. The kind of silence that suggested people were recalculating risk assessments. Vance picked up the paper again. 24 hours. Wire transfer or mining rights negotiation. Your contractor will be released to local law enforcement after medical processing. Standard procedure. Very routine. He held the paper toward the camera one final time, displaying the total at the bottom. Questions? No response from the council chamber. Then we'll await your payment confirmation. Good evening. Vance nodded to Admiral Morrison. She cut the connection. The display screen went dark. Vance stood, stretched slightly, and picked up his teacup. Walked to the window overlooking what remained of the garden. The west wing was visible as a gap in the building's profile. Afternoon sunlight created long shadows across the rubble. That killed a Wednesday, he said, apparently to himself. Admiral O'Malley made a notation in his pocket notebook. Subject disposition, medical services, 18. Law enforcement transfer, 1830, shipping method. He paused to write. Economy ground mail, cheapest available carrier. Estimated delivery, 4 to 6 weeks. Noted, Morrison replied. Admiral Chen set down his teacup and stood. Gin rummy? Gin rummy, Vance confirmed. They filed out of the communications array room, leaving their teacups on the table. Admiral Holloway paused at the door, looked back at Kyle, still wrapped in purple yarn against the wall, and made a final notation on her tablet. Documentation complete. Incident closed. She left, closing the door with a soft click. The building settled back into its regular afternoon routine. Somewhere on the first floor, the recreation room was probably being prepared for cards. The kitchen would be starting dinner preparations. The garden's irrigation system was running on schedule despite the damage. Wednesday at Serene Vistas. Very regular, very predictable, very boring. Until someone made the mistake of thinking retired fleet admirals were soft targets. Then it became considerably more expensive.